Welcome to Safe on Deck. For episode 38, I sat down with Colonel Randel Gordon at the Tullahoma Regional Airport in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Colonel Gordon was commissioned as a second lieutenant following graduation from the United States Air Force Academy in May of 1998. And upon completion of Specialized Undergraduate Pilot Training, he was selected to fly the F-15C Eagle. Following a tour flying the Eagle in Alaska, Colonel Gordon reported first to the Air Force Institute of Technology and next to Air Force Test Pilot School, before he was assigned to Eglin Air Force Base as an F-15C&E instructor pilot and experimental test pilot, and an A-10A and C and BD-700 experimental test pilot. Subsequently, Colonel Gordon served in a variety of high-profile flight test assignments across the Air Force, including as F-22 commander and director of operations at the 411th Flight Test Squadron and as vice commander of the 412th Test Wing, both at Edwards Air Force Base. Colonel Gordon is a Presidential Fellow, Harvard Business School alum, DARPA Fellow, MIT Fellow, and holds a doctorate from the U.S. Air Force's School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. Colonel Gordon currently serves as the commander of Arnold Engineering Development Complex, headquartered at Arnold Air Force Base in beautiful Tullahoma, Tennessee. Colonel Gordon is a command pilot who's logged more than 3,000 hours in over 70 different aircraft types, including the F-22A, F-15C and E, A-10A, A+ and C, E-11, and the F-16A and C. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, episode 38 with Colonel Randel Laz Gordon. Enjoy. Colonel Gordon, thanks again for waking up early and meeting me here at the airport. Really appreciate you taking so much time. Start all these interviews the same way, so I want to start yours the same way as well. Where were you born?
Well, thanks, Antonio. Thanks for having me out here. So I grew up in a place called Poughkeepsie, New York, which is about 70, 80 miles or so north of the city on the Hudson River. It's actually, in hindsight, it's actually a really, really fun place to have grown up, mainly because there's so much history around there as it relates to the Revolutionary War. So George Washington had a headquarters in a place called Newburgh, which was just around where I grew up as well. And on the Hudson River, you could still see the posts on either side of the river where the revolutionaries would string chains underneath the Hudson River to specifically block British shipping as it tried to sail up the Hudson River. So I didn't grow up that far from West Point, New York. So that whole connection with history, military, plus it's a beautiful state. It's fantastically gorgeous where I grew up. In a lot of ways, I kind of consider it pretty lucky to have grown up there.
That's awesome. So did you have that connection as a young person to history and the military, or was it something you kind of grew into as time went on?
Kind of grew into it. Where I grew up, there were a lot of veterans of foreign wars posts, VFW posts, and those sorts of things. It was a natural place where a lot of Vietnam vets retired out. You know, one of my best friends growing up, his father was a Vietnam vet, and he would tell these stories of serving in the military. I mean, let's face it, you can't get around the fact that you've got a military academy just south of you that carries so much storied tradition. I think over time, it just kind of naturally kind of seeped into my psyche, even without really even being consciously aware of it.
Okay, we've got the military. Let's get into aviation. Was there any kind of early touch points in aviation for you as a young person?
Lots of touch points with aviation when I grew up. So a couple of points, right? And this is important for all the listeners that have children that are interested in this sort of thing, or maybe feel a bit like what I did when I grew up. I definitely had an interest in aviation, mainly because my father worked for United Airlines for a while. Now, truth in lending, he had no interest in flying. He got it because it was a job at the time. And he was very honest with me about that when he told me how he ended up working at United Airlines for so many years. But the nice kind of part of that is, you know, long before 9/11 or any of those other different events happened for the world, this was the time where you could walk onto an airplane, and it's almost like that old movie Airplane, you know, where you'd walk up and the captain would put you in the chair and he'd give you a little set of plastic wings and, you know, let you touch the controls and tell you what everything was all about. So I grew up a little bit in that environment, and because my father worked for the airline, we kind of got the backstage pass into what that looked like. So, you know, I grew up around baggage handlers and maintainers of the airplanes and all the pilots, obviously. And so I saw this, but at the same time, I also understood economically where I grew up, that was a very, very far away dream. So I kind of tangentially touched into aviation, but I still very much had this thought that pilots were living gods, that was a community I could never get into. But it was nice just to every once in a while have those escapes into the world of aviation, because it was just little glimmers, little little seeds, if you will, planted into the garden of, hey, this is something that you have interest in, and wouldn't that be kind of cool to go do? The other kind of touch point with aviation for me was, again, I grew up just north of the city. And so the approaches into LaGuardia and Newark and JFK Airport flew kind of directly over top of my house. There was a National Guard base, Stewart Air National Guard Base, which I learned many, many years later, its big claim to fame is that when the Iranian hostages were brought back when Ronald Reagan was elected, Stewart Air National Guard Base was the first airport that they touched down in when they got back and repatriated to the United States. But at that airport were the C-5A Galaxy airplanes in those days. And I don't know if you've ever heard a C-5A model fly, but the sound those motors make, I mean, it's called the Galaxy, and it had this otherworldly sound when it would fly over. And so they would go into approaches to Stewart Air National Guard, and you'd hear them fly over my high school, and you just had to stop. One, just the size of the airplane is impressive to begin with. It almost looked like it was hovering. It was so large. And then the noise that it made was just mesmerizing to me. So, to answer your question, there were these aviation touch points. I could see it, but it was almost like it was on the other side of a glass window that you couldn't bust through. And I knew that there were leanings and inclinations to go that way, but I just didn't know how to actually make the connection between one side of that glass window to the other side.
What was the way? How did you finally get through?
Well, so like a lot of folks, and I'm pretty honest with this with people, because sometimes people look at colonels and they think, oh, they're perfect people. Like in the way I looked at pilots, right? Like, hey, they never make mistakes. They're confident. They know exactly what they want to go do. Everything's worked out well for them in life. One, that's not true in any way, shape, or form, right? That's just your own misgivings and your own, vulnerabilities kind of coming through. But when I was around that middle school, junior high school timeframe, I was deeply shy, very awkward, insecure. Incidentally, especially for your listeners out there, it's not as though you kind of go through some gigantic metamorphosis like a butterfly and you suddenly it still haunts you. Like everyone kind of rolls through this even now. I've just gotten better about looking back and going, oh yeah, I felt this way then, but look at how that worked out. So back to the point of what was that connection. West Point, again, long before the days of 9/11, used to be you could just drive onto the campus. And they were very good about advertising whenever they had guest speakers that would come in and talk to the cadets. Because again, like all military academies, we want to develop leaders of character and purpose. And some of that is hearing the stories of folks that have gone before you. The one time that this was advertised in the paper, my cousin saw who was going to be the guest speaker and immediately said, that's a person that Randy needs to go listen to. Because again, I was at that turning point in your life. You're trying to figure out what you want to do. And sometimes just a word, it just might be the one thing that gets you over the hump and makes you, spurs you off to action. So this particular guest speaker was a lady named Mae Jemison. I guarantee you, she doesn't know me from Adam. Never physically, I shook her hand, but when you're at that level, how many people do you meet, right? So Mae Jemison, if you're there and you hear this one day, know that you had this impact on my life. Mae Jemison was the first African-American astronaut. She had just completed her shuttle mission, and this was sort of like your, victory lap as you get a chance to go around the various venues and talk about what that experience was for you. My cousin and I, we drove up to West Point. I still remember the night very clearly. It was upstate New York, and I think it was like February-ish or so time frame. Just super cold, dark, very, very dark, because, again, you're in northern latitudes. The United States gets super dark quickly. And I remember kind of trudging through old snow, like snow that had fallen like a week ago, and now it's like frozen over, and it's like, as you're kind of, and I remember thinking, man, what am I doing here? What a waste, whatever. This person is so many leagues above where I'm at that all this is going to do is just make me feel terrible as you go into there. My cousin, bless her soul, was very, very smart, though, in saying, no, this is something you really need to hear. She just had that inclination, right? So I sat down, and Mae Jemison, far from being an astronaut, just her life in general was just absolutely fantastic. She a medical doctor, did a lot of work in developing countries. She was a ballerina, right? Did all these things. And oh, by the way, on top of that, she gets selected for the astronaut corps and flies this mission. Later on, incidentally, she had a guest spot on Star Trek, The Next Generation. She was kind of one of those cameo appearances. I remember looking, I was like, hey, that's Mae Jemison. That's kind of cool. But she tells this wonderful story of her life. And what she kind of got to at the very end, which always stuck with me, was the reason why she was able to do all these things and to, have all the success in an academic career, all the success in a medical career, all the success in her artistic dancing career, all this success as an astronaut. The reason why she was able to do that is because she never told herself no. Like, she made it a point to say, I'm going to have insecurities. I'm going to have doubts about myself applying for these things, thinking, am I good enough to go do this? But she just reached the point mentally where she just said, I'm not going to be the one to tell myself no if this is something that I'm interested in. In a way, it was very much like a gauntlet thrown on the floor. Like, I want to do this, and you guys might tell me no, but I'm not going to be the one to tell myself no. And that's effectively how she ended up in all those different positions along the way. And that was deeply powerful, right? That was deeply powerful because everything she was saying up on stage was everything I was feeling in my heart. I really want to be a pilot. I don't know how to do that. I'm sitting on West Point. I'm looking at all these cadets that are sitting in the auditorium with us. And again, they're all in their uniforms. They look super sharp and, superhuman. And I thought, oh, these guys are National Honor Societies. They're, captains of the football team, all those different kind of stereotypes you have in your head. And the fact that she was so vulnerable on stage and basically laid it out and said, look, I'm not good. What I am is I'm bold. That was super powerful. So, to your point about what was the pathway, we had no money. We were very, very poor. The community I grew up in New York didn't have pilots. It just wasn't an aviation-focused kind of community. But I knew that my way to being a pilot was to try for the Air Force Academy. I knew I liked West Point. I loved the story behind West Point. It had nothing to do, anything against the Army. It's just that West Point was so close to home that I had this fear that if I went to West Point, that I would never, ever broaden and grow out because it was literally 30 minutes from my house, right? So I thought, well, go to the Air Force Academy. Like all service academies, it's not as though there's a gigantic tuition. I think I paid like $1,900, and that was for initial buy of uniforms and some computer gear, and then that was it. And then they, our bumper sticker is it was a $250,000 education that you received for free. It's for free, quote unquote.
I've heard one nickel at a time.
One nickel at a time, exactly. But that would also be the avenue with which to make those connections and have those networks to eventually reach an aviation career, and it worked out really well. But I trace it all back to that talk, or listening to Mae Jemison talk. So again, I look back on that and I go, had it not been for that, who knows, right, where I would have been. Probably my own insecurities would have completely swamped me, and I never would have gone that route. So I always think about that when you're talking to kids or other folks that, hey, be very, very mindful of the impact that you can have with folks. Because again, Mae Jemison has no idea who I am. Zero. None, right? But her sitting up on stage and telling the story was, I think, a hinge point for me, for my life, right? So thank you, Mae Jemison, for that. And just know that I'm always trying to do the same thing when I get the opportunities to speak.
Okay, the Air Force Academy.
Yeah.
What was, again, we talked about a little bit of exposure to maybe the military, maybe aviation, but probably hadn't flown in an airplane, talking about general aviation before then, right?
Yep.
Probably not been around a lot of military folks before then. What was day one? You see all these videos and photos online. There's a lot of yelling going on and a lot of excited folks. What was day one like at the Academy?
So I'll never forget that experience either. So the summer before you get put into the Air Force Academy, we have a thing, we still do it, called Summer Scientific Seminar. Colloquially, we call that you get to be a cadet 5th class. Because there's only 4 years, so when you get it, you're cadet 4th class, 3rd class, 2nd. So cadet 5th class are juniors who are going into their senior year, and they get to come out to the Air Force Academy, and you spend a couple weeks. You live in the dorms, you eat in the chow hall, you see some of the activities or whatever. Everyone's super nice, right? No one's yelling at you or anything else. But it's a chance to see a little bit of what being a cadet would be. I think the modern term is grok, right? Like you can grok it, and grok means that rather than read about it or watch a YouTube video on it, you just go experiment with it. So you get to go live the life, right? And it's compressed. There's a beginning and an end, but it gets you a chance to get a lot of experience in a very short period of time. So the term is grok. So that's what I did, right? My father and I, he drove me out there, and our first impression getting there was, this campus is gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. Almost around 18,000 square acres, if I remember correctly, right up against the front range of the Rocky Mountains. Of the service academies, the most new, quote unquote, modern, right? And so the structures there kind of have this 1960s George Jetson, modern Art Deco kind of look to it. And we were just enthralled. I mean, completely enthralled. And then the thing that really got me was, oh, by the way, it has its own airport on the campus with its own airplanes sitting out there. And I thought, wow, there are a couple schools that have their own flying programs, but nothing, at least in my opinion, like what I saw at the Air Force Academy. So that was my initial impression of the place heading into the first day of basic. Like, wow, you feel like you're going to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. You got the ticket, you're going to go in, there's going to be this river of chocolate and everyone making candy. Oh no. By that point, all of that illusion had kind of burned off. And I remember one of my favorite memories of my father, he, takes me to the spot where the bus is there and everyone's there in their, blues with their white gloves and their wheel caps sitting on, looking all what we call strapped, right? Just very intimidating looking. And my father sees that, and the very first thing he does is he starts crying. And he cries in front of all of the cadet trainers that are sitting there and all the staff, and they're looking at this, and I'm going, Dad, no, not here, right? Don't do that. Because I was afraid that, because everyone's looking at that and they go, oh, okay, targeted. I'm going to give you a lot of crap because of what I just saw with your parents. So they were smart at the academy. They didn't really start the yelling at the bus, right? And so it was like, oh, welcome. They checked your name off the box. Oh, okay, we've been expecting you. Welcome aboard. Come grab a seat in the back of the bus kind of thing. And you get on the bus. And once the door closed and the thing drives away, then it begins, right? And it was immediately, you guys are nothing, you will speak when spoken to, etc. And it was a part of this intimidation process to what we call break down a lot of bad habits and thoughts, and then to rebuild into something different, right? That's when the process began. So just like you see in all the videos, we got yelled at constantly. Nothing that you did was right. Nothing, absolutely nothing. It was a lot of early morning wake-ups. I still remember, and to this day, I still have an affinity for this song, Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses, because the following morning at, dark 30, sure enough, there was a trash can kicked down the hallway, and at full blast was Welcome to the Jungle, Guns N' Roses. And so that was my entry song to the Air Force, was Welcome to the Jungle. I've actually kind of joked that maybe at retirement one day, I'll play that as we enter and grab our seats and then tell the story as to why, we're playing Welcome to the Jungle. It's the song that I remember waking up. And I remember in that moment when I heard that song, like there was a switch that went off in the back of my mind going, all right, bring it, right? It starts, right? I mean, this isn't for games anymore. You're really here, and you have an expectation that you're going to make the very most of this, because there are so many folks that applied to the Air Force Academy and did not get accepted and are wondering what it would have been like to have been here. Now you are here, and there's an obligation to give it all that you got.
At what point in the process, because I know, and again, no one can copy your path, my path, anyone else's path, it changes, but at what point in the process at the academy, it's 4 years, did you know, hey, I'm going to go, obviously you had that obviously distinct interest in going aviation, but you knew you had a pilot slot and you knew where you were going. How does that kind of work for you? So
it was an interesting time because this was about the point where we had too many pilots in the Air Force. And so to go to the Air Force Academy and to make it through 4 years and to get a pilot training slot on the back end of that was like, you've completely aced this, because the opportunities were so slim and the competition was extremely fierce to be able to get that. That was the world I kind of entered. Actually, interesting, surprisingly enough, medically, when you go through all your interviews heading up to an Air Force Academy appointment, medically, the establishment at the time told me I was only navigator qualified. And they never explained that. I never got good understanding as to, well, why not pilot? And I'm not sure what the distinction was between being pilot qualified or navigator qualified. It was an interesting. So I knew walking into the academy that perhaps there was a hole in the boat, if you will, as I'm leaving port, that I might get to the end of all this and they go, hey, that's great. I don't care if you were the number one graduate. Medically, right, you can't be a pilot, etc. But I kind of went, okay, well, we'll see where that one kind of goes. That was the competition at the time when I first entered. I still remember the day when, I don't know, it seems like this is kind of a common case for all military pilot pipeline things. I don't know if we haven't figured this out yet, but you either have too many or you have too few. Right, either the faucet's turned on or is completely off, and there's no gray zone in between. So when I joined, the faucet was completely turned off. right? Like, oh, we got too much. Stop it. What are we going to do, et cetera? And then about 2/3 of the way through the Air Force Academy, I remember they brought us all into a room and it effectively said, hey, so long as you can see the flight line and you can see that there's airplanes out there, you are all pilot qualified. And so long as you can do that, you're going to go fly something. I don't know what it's going to be, helicopters, props, or jets or whatever, but you're all going to be pilots. And it didn't really matter so much about your grade point average anymore, what your athletic scores or your military scores were. Effectively, what they were saying is the shortage has now become so dire that everybody has to go. And if you don't want to go, you need to explain yourself to the senior leadership. So there's almost like a barrier that was there to discourage people from turning down a pilot training slot. I remember feeling this great weight fall off my shoulders, like, all right, it's going to happen. This is fantastic. The other thing that happened kind of during my time as well is we had a flight screener program that the cadets would go through, a sort of like a prep heading into pilot training. And I believe, although I can't prove, but I believe if I'm not the last, I'm certainly one of the last people to have completed the full check ride in that program before they ended up canceling the program because of a series of incidents that occurred along the way. So effectively what they told me was, again, so long as you can medically, this is a hyperbole, but you kind of get what I'm saying. So long as you can see that there's a flight line, you're good, right? Let's make you a pilot. And then they also saw that I was one of the last guys to be able to complete all of the flight screener stuff. And so what that meant is I got pushed to the head of the line to go to pilot training on graduation because they needed to get us through. Like there was a small group of cadets by that point that had completed everything, and they just needed to get us out the door to go to pilot training as early as we possibly could. So I graduated the Air Force Academy in May of 1998, and then by August of 1998, I was already at flight training.
Okay, 98, so putting in time and space. I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah.
T-37, right?
Yeah, T-37 back in those days.
6,000-pound dog whistle.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Tell me about the tweet.
Well, I'll tell you, I actually have a warm spot in my heart for the tweet because you're right. It was exceptionally loud airplane. But to me at that point, anything I had flown up to that point were sailplanes or single-engine, propeller-driven, Cessna or Piper kind of airplanes. And so when you show up and you go, okay, here's a twin-engine jet that is fully acrobatic with a retractable landing gear. To me, that airplane was kind of a starship at the time because it had all of these different systems and it weighed more and it flew faster and flew higher than anything I had ever flown beforehand. And so I look at that airplane very, very fondly. It's interesting now because they're all in museums. They're up on sticks somewhere along the way, which is amazing considering the seemingly billions amount of airplanes that we bought for the T-37. But I deeply enjoyed flying that airplane. The thing I'm always grateful for is kind of like what we talked about in the beginning. I never went through that phase in my life where it's like, oh, I want to be a fireman or I want to be a lawyer or a doctor or, pet doctor or something. I never went through that phase. I knew very much from the beginning that I wanted to fly. I mean, I certainly saw nudges, things that helped me along the way, like my father and, living close to airport and those sorts of things. All that certainly helped. But I wish I could point to a period of time where I went, that's it. That's the thing that made me want to go to aviation. It just kind of emerged in my head. But once it was there was nothing else. And so when I got to pilot training, I realized in that moment, you're getting paid to do the thing that you love to do. And you're doing it with people that you really respect, friends that I still have to this day. And it didn't matter what that airplane was, right? It could have been, an ultralight for all I care. If that's what the Air Force would use to transition people to being rated officers. I was just deeply grateful to be there and to do that. But I did absolutely love the tweet, miss it to this day. Many years later in test pilot school, they actually, at the time, they brought out a T-37 for us to go fly. And it was like getting reacquainted with an old friend. And I remember at the time, because, again, it's the most complex advanced airplane you'd ever seen. They hand you what, we call the Dash 1 in the Navy. It's the NATOPS, right? But they handed that to you, and that was like the thickest piece of, regulation I'd ever seen in my life. And I remember just sweating and, trying to study this and what ops limits that and G limit this and whatever else. And then by the time I got back to it many decades, kind of later, I was like, why was this ever hard? Because by that point, you had transitioned to much more complex and capable airplanes. And then when you go back, and now what looked to me like this insurmountable regulation looked like a pamphlet about here's everything you need to know about the T-37. I was like, wow, this is easy. This is great.
I have a friend recently that just got picked for helicopters, and he was lamenting that, yes, all the notes, warnings, and cautions and all the EPs for the TH-57, the mighty Bell 206. And oh, I just wanted to tell him, buddy, one day the Romeo or the Sierra, the helicopter that you're going to fly is going to make this. It's going to make it look like made by Mattel, right? Yeah. It's a little toy. So that's awesome. Okay, any good T-37 flying stories? I'm guessing there's a couple solos in there, a little bit of aero instruments. I don't want to assume, but what? Tell me about flying the airplane.
The thing that was probably because by that point I knew how to fly a bit because I got that from the Air Force Academy. I was what they call a soaring instructor, so our glider program that we have there. So I got a chance to fly. And then by that point, by the time I had made it to go into pilot training, we had also paid for private flying lessons outside of that. So I had a private pilot certificate. In that summer, right, between May and August of 1998, your break, if you will, I was such an aviation dork that I used that time to go get an instrument certificate. So now you're getting paid as a second lieutenant, which means I had gobs of money compared to what I had as a cadet. And I was like, well, what do I do with this? Do I go buy a Corvette like a lot of folks do? Or do I use this money to go get some additional flying lessons because I knew I wanted to crush pilot training. I wanted to walk in there day one and just like, I own this, right? Because it's exactly where I wanted to be. So I knew by that point how to fly an airplane. I just needed to learn how to fly a T-37, but it's not as though I needed to learn theories of lift or what an aileron does or anything else. So that part was completely wired, if you will. The one thing that T-37s really introduced me to, one was a lot of the acrobatics, because again, I just didn't do that in the types of sailplanes that I flew, and especially the Cessna 172. Not recommended for people listening. But it was the acrobatics that was really fascinating to me. Going upside down, I loved that. And then the other side was formation flying. Had zero, well, I had some exposure to that in sailplanes when you do aerotow, but the notion of being just a couple feet off of someone's wingtip while you're in 90 degrees of bank, as you're doing kind of these nice kind of, turns through the airspace, that part was completely alien to me. I found those very, very challenging, but like in a good way. Like it's one of those, hey, this is interesting and new. This is a completely different way of looking at flying. So those experiences are the ones that really kind of brought to me. And then I'm not sure if they have this tradition in the Navy, but in the Air Force, your first solo, they literally pull you out of the airplane when you're done, all your buds, and they carry you over, they take off all your flight gear or whatever, and then they throw you into the solo pool, which was this tiny little, I think it was filled with rainwater. It was fairly nasty, but they throw you in there. The outside had been painted up, and each class kind of puts their own marking on it just to talk about it. And I remember that day very well too, of coming out of the airplane and just getting thrown, and it was almost like a baptism. Like you come out of that and you're like, wow, I flew a military twin-engine aerobatic jet, and I did it all by myself, and I lived through it, and it was just a huge confidence builder to that point. So those are my kind of big fond memories of the T-37.
At the end of your time in the T-37, you're obviously going to select. Track select is what we'd call it.
Yep.
Trying to guess, probably helicopters, big wing, TAC Air, or jets? Those are the three options?
Yeah, you bet. So in those days, and it's different now, but in those days, everyone went through T-37s. And then you could track select if you wanted to go to fly a heavy airplane like cargo, bomber, or really cargo is really what it was. You would do a T-1 Jayhawk, which is it's a derivative of a civilian version. But think of it like a very small, like almost very light jet sized twin engine business jet that you would go fly. If you were going the combat track, right? So fighters, bombers, you would go fly the T-38. If you're going helos, at that point you would split off, and then you would go do training with the Army from that point forward. So yeah, that's the point where everyone would kind of track and split up.
Okay, so three options. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing you probably had some mentors and folks in the tweet that kind of helped point you in the right direction. Yeah. Hoping maybe you could talk about maybe a good story from one of those mentors, and then where'd you end up track selecting?
Yeah, so I track selected the fighters, mainly because, and I still remember this to this day. So here's another good lesson as well, and this is something that I remembered being a test pilot many years later. The first day of pilot training, the wing commander walked in. I remember this guy, gruff, looking old. If he could have carried a cigar, he would have, just kind of had that look, right? He just, kind of carried that presence and that aura when he walked in the room. And of course, you're a class full of second lieutenants, right? What do you know? You don't know any different. So he walks in as the colonel and immediately kind of gives his welcome speech, right? Like, hey, welcome to pilot training. This is Laughlin Air Force Base, Del Rio, Texas. And he looks around and he goes to every person in the room and basically says, hey, what do you hope to fly? What do you want to fly? And, my class was a little bit under 30 people. And almost to a person, we all said, fighters, we want to go fly fighters, you know. Then as you go through the T-37 and you're wearing a helmet with the visor down and the mask up, and it's like 9,000 degrees outside because it's Del Rio, Texas, and the air conditioner in the T-37 no worky so well, and you go upside down and you pull G's, and people start realizing, you know, this really isn't for me, right? And so people start track selecting, you know, off from that point, right? What I learned in pilot training, because again, the stereotype is you go there and you fly fighters and therefore life must be awesome and you're a god and move forward. That's really not true. In reality, anything you get from pilot training is fantastic, right? You grow to love it. People that fly tankers think it's the best thing ever, right? People that fly bombers think it's the best thing ever. Fighters, that best thing ever. And when I went through test pilot school later and they bring out all these different airplanes for you to go mess with, that's 100% true. They all have pros and cons. There's no perfect, you know, the fighters, they have their own problems, right? Everything has its own ups and downs that you just kind of have to learn to love and embrace. But it's not as though, ooh, you went to pilot training and you got, therefore you're, no, it doesn't work that way. At the end of the day, you're getting paid to fly an airplane, which is the most glorious deal I think I've ever heard in my life. For me, what I knew is I 100% absolutely loved going upside down. I just thought that was like black magic and sorcery, that you could take an airplane, go upside down, and everything is fine. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed pulling G's. I enjoyed the discipline of going to the gym and trying to like improve your physical endurance and your strength so that you are physically capable of what the airplane can go do. And then also, you know, I had this, and we can talk a little bit later going off to fighter training. One of the things that really kind of appealed to me about the fighter world is, you know, standard. Again, I grew up extremely awkward. You know, you can't see it on the podcast, but I am a minority, and I grew up in a spot where, you know, that really meant something, right? Like you're walking around and you just feel like alone and isolated, a little bit strange, kind of walking about. You get bullied like everyone kind of does at some point along the way. And this notion of being a fighter pilot really kind of appealed to me because I thought you can be the hero, right? You can show up, you can be the guy with the white hat, the standoff at noon, whatever, at high noon, you know, the cowboys doing the draw. I just had this notion that being a fighter pilot meant that you could protect the weak, right, against the strong. So there was sort of this ideal and this ethos that went along with, well, you can fly upside down, you can do all these other things. So for me, I absolutely wanted to track select two fighters. The T-37s, it's nice because at that point, they make sure all your instructors have a really big background, right? So you got some instructors that were cargo guys, some instructors that were fighter folks. And I remember just being completely enthralled with the stories of the fighter guys who were talking about these airplanes and what they could go do. And so for me at that time, early in my aviation career, that's all that I ever wanted to do was to go that way. And I was lucky enough to get selected to go that way.
And you flew the T-38.
Yeah.
One of the coolest jets. And you still fly, by the way, the T-38.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Talon.
Yeah, the Talon. So here's my first impression of the Talon, two things. When I got to Del Rio, Texas, I think the T-38s were on night flying at the time. So I arrived this, you know, again, it was about summer 1998 or whatever. So you get to pilot training. I remember even before it, because I mean, you know, that first month of pilot training, there's no flying, right? It's academics. It's a lot of the administrative stuff, in processing, some medical things, whatever. So you haven't touched an airplane at all. Del Rio's pretty tiny base. The dormitories where all the lieutenants, it kind of sits a little bit up on a hillside and overlooks the flight line. And so in the evenings, you would get out there and the T-38s were doing their night flying. And I remember they'd get to the end of the runway, they'd close the canopies, and then they would do the run up to check the engines, and then they would select afterburner. And again, you know, looking back on it, it's kind of comical because the T-38 engines are pretty small, right, compared to what you see in like an F-16 or whatever. But it didn't matter because again, you know, what have I flown up to that point? I'd flown sailplanes, I'd flown single engine Cessnas. When the T-38 lit those afterburners, and you would see this plume of purple fire come shooting out the back end of that thing and just hear the roar across the whole flight line, that was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So I do remember that like emotional impression on me because no other airplane on that field did that. The T-37 certainly did not, but the T-38 had that to it. The other thing I remember was, because again, you're in the student training squadron building, and when we would all get to the what we call our ops desk, so that's basically the front desk where you sign out and you do your last kind of checks before you walk out to the airplane. We would show up in our T-37 stuff, and you know, we carry our parachutes and you know all other stuff. The T-38 guys would show up and they carried speed jeans, right, which were the G suit that you would put on over top of your lower body to help squeeze the blood to where it needed to be when you're under load. And just looking over at that, it just looked cool, right? They looked like cowboys to me with the speed jeans on, and they'd walk out. And so everything about that just kind of oozed cool factor, right? So when I finally got there, same thing, again, that insecurity never fully leaves you. You just get a little better about how to deal with it over time. I remember being very intimidated by the T-38 because it was so much faster than a T-37, could go so much higher, could go supersonic, not much, right? But it could go supersonic. And then this notion of having the twin afterburners on there was just, you felt like you had made it, right? Getting a chance to go fly the Talon.
Do you think the T-38 prepared folks well? Obviously, it was designed in the, I want to say, 50s or 60s to get folks ready for that Century Series fighter.
Yep.
We still fly it today. Obviously, the replacement is in the wings and coming soon. But do you feel that airplane was a good preparation for the fighters and all the incredible aircraft you went on to fly later?
I think from a standpoint of the mentality of flying a high-performance airplane, it was absolutely there. Now, from an avionics standpoint, clearly not, right? But just from the notion of, here's this airplane, doesn't carry a lot of fuel. You have to be very much like your mental clock has got to be going pretty quickly because you just don't have a lot of time to just hang around, right? So you got to fit your profile in. The maneuvers that you did, because the wings are so small, were huge, right? So a loop in that airplane was 10,000, ish or so feet just to do a loop. And so you had to be very diligent about, okay, well, if I want to do a loop and I don't want to fly out of the airspace and bust my check ride, I've got to plan to do this at this point, and I got to pull so much, right? Because the margins on either side of that were super small. Same thing like when you're flying around in the traffic pattern. Again, you just got to get very, very good about being in tune with how the airplane responds to you, the burbles, the sounds of it, whatever, because the margin of, hey, that's a safe way to do your approach, vice, hey, you're too slow, wasn't very large. And so you had to be very disciplined about airspeed control, angle of attack control, all those other things. And so that discipline and that mindset that went with it, I thought was fantastic for getting off to fighters, because by that point, when you're in an airplane that has all these sensors on board and everything else, much, much easier to fly. Like an F-15, much easier to fly, I think, than a T-38. But because you had built such discipline about flying an airplane that had such slim margins on either side, now when you got to something that was much more complex, it was already second nature to it. Like you didn't have to devote a lot of brain bites to that. So I really enjoyed it just for that. Not to mention, it is personal, looks are subjective, but I think a Talon is a good-looking airplane. It looks exactly like how it's named, right? Slender, drawn, very thin, with this Coke bottle fuselage to it to help it go supersonic and reduce the drag. Even today, it's a very old airplane, right? Came out in the 1960s, but it still looks very, very good to me. Before we started recording, you told a story and mentioned a phrase I've never heard before in my life: Talon kisses. Yeah. Hoping maybe you could kind of tell that story one more time. Yeah, these are just my kind of terms. I don't know if it's like widely spread across the Air Force. It's on the internet now. So. Yeah, it's on the internet, so therefore it's true, it's right? True, it has to be. But every T-38 pilot knows the air conditioner system in there has got some quirks, got some interesting things to it. And one of them is this little honeycomb vent that's on the right side of the front cockpit, where, as you get up in altitude, like a lot of modern fighter, or a lot of fighters that were built in that era, the air conditioner doesn't work worth of anything on the ground. You have to get airborne and, have the engines up and to be able to get some decent airflow going through there. But it's not uncommon that some ice pellets, some little water condenser sock in there that, as air would go through there, that would freeze, and then it would spit out these tiny little ice crystals that come shooting out at like supersonic speeds directly at the right side of your neck and just pelt you a little bit with just tiny little ice pellets. So I used to call them Talon kisses. But it was just one of those kind of quirks of the air conditioner system. I love it. It's an awesome looking airplane. You still fly it. Again, I guess we can fast forward a little bit. You still fly it to this day. The Great Tennessee Air Show back in June. Yeah. You brought one of the jets from, is it Holloman, correct? Yeah, Holloman. Yeah. What was that cross country like? Well, so it's fun. One of the, if I could call it, downsides of being a fighter pilot is you spend a lot of your time training in a military airspace. So you take off from your field, you go to a military airspace, you come back, right? And you do that over and over and over and over and over and over again. So you get really, really good at that. And then one day someone says, oh yeah, you're going to take this airplane to some other airport off field that you're not familiar with, and you're going to leave the protected cocoon of the military airspace. And that can be a little bit of an event, right? Whereas for the heavy pilots, they do that routinely, right? It's no sweat off of their back. So it was kind of fun just getting the jet to fly cross country. It's not built very well for that because, again, it's got very, very short legs fuel-wise. And it's just kind of it's a neat and challenging thing. Again, the margins aren't all that particularly great, and so you got to get very good about, okay, I don't have a weather radar, I don't have anti-skid brakes in this airplane, so I got to be very mindful of what the runway condition is. I got to be very mindful of weather. I can only go so far before I got to find, and oh, by the way, I got to have diverts, and again, I don't have a lot of fuel, right? So it's actually surprisingly a bit challenging to do a cross country in a T-38, and so it was nice just to kind of dust off those neurons again and to get it to come back again. But I'll give you one other story from the T-38 because I think this is significant because it kind of goes back to this overarching theme I'm trying to get folks across here, which is, am I good enough, right? Can I do it? My defining story from a T-38, and it's the only time it's ever happened to me, hopefully it never happened again, was that I got a bat strike on my first night solo in the T-38. So same thing, it's Laughlin, it's dark, part of to be a winged aviator in the Air Force, you got to go do night solos. I remember, because again, the instructors are not going to put their students in really challenging conditions. So there's very, very strict limits in terms of what winds can be, what the moon illumination can be, clouds, weather, all those things that go with it. So this night was pristine, gorgeous, full moon, still air, gorgeous. And I remember taking off solo into this thing, and it was sort of like this fantasy dream, it felt like to me. Now, it's a very prescribed profile that you fly. They're obviously, they don't want you to get too crazy for good reason. And everything was going just swimmingly gorgeous, right? And I remember coming back, and I remember thinking, this is great, how awesome this was. And I come back from my very first touch and go at Eglin Air Force Base. I touch down. Everything's looking good. I'm in the zone. I advance the throttles up to take off again. And right about the point where the nose wheel comes off for takeoff, I hear this whoomph, immediately. And I look, and there's mirrors up on the glare shield in a T-38. And so the mirrors were kind of positioned, I can look behind. And I saw through the mirrors what looked like the 4th of July of just these purple and white sparks going everywhere, and it literally looked like a firework from the 4th of July that came up. So it was so bright, it lit up the inside of the cockpit at night just from the ambient light from what was going on behind the airplane. And then immediately everything in the cockpit, master caution, engine gauges, all these other things going off. And I was like, ooh, what's up with this? Now, it was interesting because, again, a T-38 doesn't have a lot of margin to it, and it was right on rotation and liftoff. And so I was like, well, I'm already there. Let's keep going, right? Keep going. Once I got airborne, there's some procedures. You want to get above your single engine takeoff speeds, all those sorts of things. I retracted the gear, and I still remember to this day when that happened. It's an emergency. It happens. It's real quick. And my natural human reaction was to go, I need to slow this down because I need to understand what this is all about. So instinctively, without thinking about it too much, I brought the throttle back, which is exactly the wrong thing to do because you're in a critical phase of flight. And the T-38 let me know that, right? And immediately you get the burble and it was like, and immediately kind of whipped me out of that stupor, like, you idiot, go full power. So full afterburner on both engines just to get the airplane to a good flyable, safe speed, retract the flaps. And then from that point forward, it was the first time this ever happened to me. Once I got through that burble of, hey, bringing the throttle back, bad idea. Then immediately all the simulator training, the stand-ups that we do, hey, you're single engine, here's what you do, what we call a fever check. You're looking for erratic fuel flows and EGTs and all the other kind of blah, 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 blah. It immediately kicked in almost as like it was a habit. And what I was surprised by is once I got over the initial, what was that? My heart rate slowed way down, my breathing came under control, and it felt like I had been there before, right? Now, in my case, I got lucky. The engine could not operate at any power setting above idle. Anything above there, it would protest and start vibrating around, whatever, but it had good ops limits and it was safe to operate in idle. So I elected to keep it there just so I can have redundancy just in case and just fly everything off of the other engine. Come back around, declare the emergency, land, shut down. They taxi me off or whatever with the tug and drag me around. By the time I made it back to the flight room, like all the instructors were like, that was awesome. That was great. Look at what you did. I got a quick safety award out of it, but it did teach me that, hey, in the midst of it, you are good enough to be here, and the training that you've received will help you in those scenarios where it was kind of instant, right, to come back to it. But yeah, it was a bat strike. Apparently I had hit, I don't know what you call it, a flock of bats. I don't know if that's the correct term, but there were multiple bats that were crossing the runway at that exact moment in time. At least one of them went down the left engine intake and shredded the compressor section heading out the back end. And then there were a couple other bats that I hit with the belly of the airplane that, they ended up on the runway. So when they did the FOD sweep afterwards, they brought back in the remains of all these bats. And then the following morning, I went to the maintenance hangar where they had pulled my motor out, and it looked like Swiss cheese. Like it was totally shredded compressor blade. So I got this picture of this tiny little bat that they pulled from the runway, one of the ones that didn't go down the inlet, and then what that did to the engine on the way out. So it was a good confidence builder of, hey, that was probably, especially by that point, the most significant emergency I'd ever experienced in my life, and I came through it okay.
And again, like you talked about, all that training, and one nickel at a time, it really does make a difference. And in that moment, there have been people that have panicked. And I've had a couple little emergencies in the T6 and the 53, but Yeah, that feeling of confidence coming away from it. The training worked.
Yeah.
All those folks that spent that time and effort and energy to make you, who you were, they saved your life, literally. But with your hands, because you were the one that actually did it that time.
Yeah, there was no one else there. And, again, I wasn't perfect in the execution of that because, again, I brought the throttle back. Dumb idea. Again, you get time dilation, things slowed down. I was like, don't do that, right? I could almost feel my instructor yelling at me from the back seat, like, what are you doing? Put the throttle back up. And then immediately just get into the checklist, start running through all the boldface that we ran through. It came all back, right? And it validated all of that work that you had done just to be able to get to that spot. Drop
night. You're a fighter guy.
Yeah.
Obviously, I know the answer to this question, but I still have to ask it.
Yeah.
What did you end up going on to fly? And what was that like finding out where you were going to go?
So this goes to a little bit of culture and ethos, right? Because, again, anything you get from pilot training is awesome. Anything. I don't care what it is, right? For me... I'll never forget this. Most of the way through T-38 training, they eventually have because again, all your instructors by that point, they're all fighter pilots, right? And so you got F-15s and F-16s and A-10 guys and whatever else. And they do, I think it was on one of those days where the weather was too bad to fly. And so it was, okay, why don't we have the instructors talk to us about what their platforms were and what do they think are the pros and cons of it, right? And so I remember the F-16 guy got up and said, hey, we're the jack of all trades and the master of none. We can do all the missions. We do suppression of enemy air defenses and air interdiction and air whatever. So here's our airplane. It can do everything. It's the most proliferated modern fighter in whatever times and et cetera, right? So he gets up and kind of gives that story. The A-10 guy gets up and talks about, well, we're the Warthog. We're close air support. Here's all the things we do to support ground troops, and we're the best built fighter for this, and kind of talks about, the lineage of the, A-1 Sky Raider and all these different airplanes that were in the past. The Eagle driver stands up, gave the shortest speech of any of them, and he said exactly this, and I quote, 104-0. And God help the first one of you that messes that up. And he sits down. That's the only thing he says. Right? And what he was getting at is, hey, this airplane has 104 aerial victories and no losses. And it was almost like when you go to recruiting fairs for the military and like the Army or the Air Force, we're like, we'll pay for college and we'll do this and look at all these things that will happen to it. And then you go to the Marines and there's a guy there in a t-shirt that's like way too small and he's got huge arms and big trap muscles and there's a pull-up bar. And it was almost like we don't make you promises, we make you Marines, right? And do you think you're good enough to come join us? Well, step up to the pull-up bar and see what you can do about that. Kind of like that warrior Spartan ethos, King Leonidas thing. That's exactly what I got from this Eagle driver when he stood up and just said 104-0, and God help the first one of you to mess that up. And he just sat down, right? So it was very much a, hey, are you good enough to be an F-15 C model driver in those days? And there was an expectation that, hey, you asked to join us, right? Not the other way around. And so if you can come to our standard and you can perform at that level, we'd love to have you, but you got to work to do that, right? Is kind of what I was getting from them. So to me, that challenge, again, I'm awkward, I'm shy, how do I kind of get through this? But it was this notion of, hey, that's the next mountain, right? That's the next mountain to go to is, can you be good to be able to keep that record and keep going forward. So to me, I was very much about the F-15 C model. Gorgeous airplane, beautifully designed. There was a notion back in Mac Air, McDonnell Douglas at the time, that there was not a pound for air to ground is what they kept saying. And that airplane was built specifically to go do that. But what I learned, especially as a test pilot, getting a chance to see a lot of these different communities, is that the culture of those communities, you kind of adopted that culture. So to the Eagle guys, air superiority, lots of different terms have gone for it, but to the Eagle community, that was like a religion, right? Like you were in the high priesthood. And could you perform at that elite level of aviation to be the F-15 C model guys? Because you understand, in a modern combat scenario, if you don't have dominance of the air, like if you don't have control of the skies, you don't have anything. And so it can disrupt so many other things. So that's why there was such a ethos around the F-15 C model community. So when they asked me, hey, what do you want to do? It was at the very top of my list. I want to be an F-15 driver. I want to be a C model driver. That's exactly what I want to go do. And again, I was lucky. I was fortunate. They actually had an F-15C that was available in my class drop. And so when they bring you up on track night and they kind of make a lot of fun of you and, oh, what a terrible, here's all the stupid things. Hey, this guy took a bat, blah, 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 whatever. But then at the end of all, when they make fun of you, they put a picture up on the PowerPoint slide deck behind you. You have all your friends and family in the audience and they go, the F-15C model. And it was just like, I made it, right? Like, I'm going to get a chance to go compete at the NFL level of fighterdom. And wow, how cool is that going to be? So I was super stoked to go.
Tyndall Air Force Base, Panama City?
Tyndall,
That's the
Tyndall.
training unit?
Oh,
All
yeah,
right.
completely.
First flight in the F-15?
Here's what I remember about that one. And again, at every successive stage, right, the T-37 was a gigantic leap from a sailplane, right? The T-38 was it's got afterburners and can go supersonic and whatever else. The F-15, what I remember about the Eagle is the size of this thing. Every community makes fun of every other community in the fighter world. The F-15 is called the tennis court because of the real estate, square footage of it is like the flying tennis court. It was gigantic. It was bigger than the apartment I was living in at the time, like literally bigger, like no hyperbole. It was at least twice the size of the apartment that I was living in at the time. I'm 5'9", and depending on how much fuel is on board the airplane, you can actually walk directly underneath the fighter jet and the top of your head will not brush the belly of the airplane because it sits so tall, right? The landing gear or whatever is just so tall above the ground. And I remember climbing that step ladder. It felt like you were trying to get up on top of your roof to go do some, roofing up, whatever. So you're climbing up this thing and it's rung after rung after rung, and it just kept going forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And then you sit up on top of this thing and it's literally like sitting on top of your roof with a nose wheel steering button. And I mean, just the scale of this thing. When you walk around to the back of the airplane, the motors were just, I felt like I could put a T-38 into the engine because they were just big, right? The diameter of the engine cavity was huge. So one, you get to a place like Tyndall, like a storied location at the time, the home of the Eagle. They flew F-4s out of there for a while, eventually Raptors, for a while. So it was sort of like the cradle of all air dominance. And now you were a part of that. And same thing, I'll never forget. And Bean, if you're out there listening to this, Bean Freeney was the director of operations of our training unit for the F-15C. Kind of like that same Eagle driver when I was in pilot training that said 140, and then he sat down, like his whole speech was like 10 seconds. Bean Freeney was very much kind of in that priesthood of the religion of air dominance. And he stood up and, first day of F-15 training, he walks up and he says, "You know nothing now, all of you, you know nothing. But in 6 short months, you will be able to take this airplane off any weather, day or night, doesn't matter. Go find the tanker, get gas off the tanker, and then go be the living nightmare of any MiG-29 pilot on the planet." And he sat down. It was kind of like, hey, the world needs ditch diggers too. So I don't want to hear you complaining about how hard or tough this is. You asked to join us, but if you stick with it, we're going to make you into warriors. And I thought that was cool, right? It was like a John Wayne moment. You just sat down and be like, you're going to be the nightmare of every MiG-29 driver on the planet, right? And he sat down. And so when I got out for that first flight in the F-15, I very much had this sense of walking around that airplane and kind of going, this airplane can go so high, so fast. It can pull so many Gs. Unlike the T-38, it's got the gigantic radar sitting in the front and all these other sensors on board, carries weapons, right? It can do all of these things. Can you, right? Can you join with this thing, right? Like basically merge and be one entity with this airplane? And even though it can do all these capabilities, can you own up to your part of the bargain, right? Because you can put any pilot in that F-15 and, they can go out but if they put you in there, can you get the airplane to do all the things it needs to go do? So I remember very much that challenge, that gauntlet that was on the floor of you need to come up and step up your game to be able to make this airplane do what it can do best. And it was tough. It was tough. I thought, because you go through pilot training and you're like, oh yeah, it's great. I got T-37s to T-38s. I get the T-38s and I get the F-15. That's great. It's awesome. Whatever else like that. And then I got to F-15 school and I busted at least 2 rides in there, which I hadn't really done up until that point. And it was very much all right, tough it out, man. All right, shake it off. You didn't do well today. You're going to fail this ride. You got to do it again. And by that point, you're like, I failed. It's like, what am I going to do? But it was very much of, hey, man, there's a standard. Again, you asked to join us, right? So can you meet to that standard? So it was very, very tough getting through F-15 training for me because there was just so much coming at you so quick. And the level of expected performance was so high because, again, it was the priesthood of air dominance. And that's the only mission it had. It didn't have, we go do all it. All you did was that one thing, which meant that you better be the best on the planet on that one. So I definitely remember having some struggles going through that course. But at the end of the day, again, it's the Nietzsche thing, right? What doesn't kill you makes you a bit stronger if you want it to. And I definitely wanted to.
Okay, so finishing up training, obviously a couple different locations in the world that you could fly the F-15.
Yeah.
Where'd you end up going next?
So I ended up going to Alaska, which is Elmendorf Air Force Base, Alaska. And at the time, I remember picking it because of all there was no such thing as a bad Eagle base, at the time. Any place you went, it was going to be awesome. It was either, you can go to the beach, you can go to the mountains, you can go to the city, right? But all of our locations were really, really awesome kind of places. And so when I looked at what the potential places to go, Alaska, of them all, to me at least, was the most exotic. You don't just happen to find yourself passing through Anchorage, Alaska. You have to go there with a deliberate purpose, right, of what it was going to be. So I thought, hey, I'm young. You don't have a lot of entanglements. Let's go have some adventure with this. And if you're going to fly the Eagle, let me go to, to me, probably the most interesting place to go at the time was Alaska, because I'd never been there before in my life. I've only seen it in picture books and stories by that point. So I got very, very fortunate to get a chance to get assigned to the 19th Fighter Squadron, the Gamecocks, up in Elmendorf Air Force Base, Alaska.
What's the mission set up there for the Gamecocks?
So everything at that stage, it's since been moved on to other things, but it was about, again, air superiority. In the F-15, you're literally on the roof of the world because you're very, very up there, which means it puts you in good position for a lot of different, combat AORs, if you will, that you need to go do. Plus, that place at the time had the mission of air defense of the United States. And so occasionally you would be scrambled on alert to go intercept whatever airplane was crossing the air defense identification zone at the time. So it was neat to have kind of both of those missions. We could deploy to just about any place on the planet. And in our peacetime capacity, we were sitting alert missions for that.
What's it like sitting alert?
So I actually enjoyed it because you would get out to the alert facility. You had these airplanes, they're fully loaded, ready to go, fully fueled, right? You'd go out in what we would call hot cock 'em, which means that you would pre-flight, get everything ready to go such that if you ever did get scrambled, you can get airborne in a certain amount of time. And the thing I always remember about the alert facility is it had a fireman's pole, because you would sit up a couple floors from where the airplanes were. And in the event that the klaxon went off, you had to be able to get to the airplanes as quick as possible. Steps take too long. So the easiest thing is go to the fireman's pole and go slide up and down that thing. So it was kind of fun because you'd seen that on all the old kind of movies and shows. And there I was, in this building with a fireman's pole that would get you out to the airplane. But it was good. I mean, we would practice and we would try to get our times down and work a lot with the, different commands up there to be able to go where we needed to go do. But it was a very, very interesting mission, very challenging mission, especially in Alaska with weather being what it was. Because again, you had to be able to perform that mission just like Bean Freeney's did, right? Anytime, day or night, weather, whatever, go. So I really enjoyed learning that mission.
Any memorable intercepts from that time?
Not an intercept, but I do remember on one of our practice missions, we were flying out in the far, far hinterlands of Alaska. And on the way back home, we flew past and we looked down and we saw the wreckage of what looked like an old Cub, right, sitting on the Alaska tundra. And so we looked at that and I called on the radio. I was like, hey, did you see that? And we're like, yeah, absolutely. So we kind of swung back around, took a look, and sure enough, there was this J3 Cub that was kind of sitting in the tundra with one of its main gears snapped off, kind of sitting off on the side. And Alaska, one of the really kind of neat things about Alaska is to get anywhere in the state, you pretty much have to be a pilot, right? There's no roads. Not a lot of places are accessible via waterways or anything else. So it is like the mecca for people that are Alaska bush pilots. And kind of like the open sea, right? If you come across a distressed ship, there's an expectation that you're going to go help. Same thing, right? You're flying around the Alaska hinterlands where you're hundreds of miles away from any type of civilization. And in the middle of all that, you see a crashed airplane and you go, ooh, got to help them out. So we came back around. It's funny. You're in this F-15 and you can't travel very slow in that F-15. And so you're trying to pull a tail number off of this airplane because you're talking to air traffic control and you're trying to say, hey, what is it? So you fly by and one guy is like, it's November. Okay. Next I go was like 7, right? November 7, copy. 4, right? So after a couple of different passes, we finally got the full tail number of this thing. Turns out, obviously they did crash, but the airplane had been sitting there for a couple of days. They had called out and they got another airplane to come pick them up, and they were trying to figure out how to get back there. But it was just this interesting thought of, hey, I'm in this F-15 that's designed to go intercept whatever that might come across the line. And in the process of doing that, hey, maybe, we can help out this person. So it worked out to be okay, but I do remember that. The other part I remember is I think it was Fish and Wildlife. They wanted to understand the effects of fighter noise and jet noise on the mating rituals of different caribou herds. And so we got scrambled, if I could say as much, in a joint government mission to go help this Fish and Wildlife kind of service. And so I remember, there was a ranger kind of sitting, wildlife, kind of sitting out in the bush with a radio, and he would call up and he says, all right, I want you to run it on this axis at this altitude and this airspeed, because he's trying to see what happens to the caribou as you go by. So I remember doing missions against the caribou.
It's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, you mentioned the weather. I'm guessing there are probably more than one or two flights that all you saw was a wingtip. Another F-15 as they dragged you up or down through the weather. Maybe you could talk about the weather in Alaska and how that impacted the flying.
So we got very, very, very good at instrument flying. Very, very good. What would have been like, wow, I don't know if I want to go flying that today to Alaska. That was just a Tuesday, right? Especially during the wintertime. So you got very, very good at that. Flying instruments, flying instrument trail, like what we call, where, you have airplanes take off and you're using your radar to keep track of them as they go through the weather up above. And you got very, very good at how to land that airplane, because you're coming back to a runway that probably had some level of standing water, ice, slush, snow on it the whole time. It's, obviously during the wintertime, which lasted a long time in Alaska. So I have never been as good as instruments as what I was as a young lieutenant, young captain in those days, going through Alaska. I always credit just because, again, it was a fantastic squadron to learn those sorts of things. You're learning how to be a fighter pilot. You're learning that culture. At that time, your whole point in life was to just get exceptionally good at flying that airplane. That's the only thing you really had to go deal with at that level. Yeah, how about that for drama? We got some lightning going on up the side. Talking about weather. Here we go.
Seriously. I love it.
And on top of that, you just had to be a really, really smart aviator, because weather was absolutely a factor up there in much the way that a MiG-29 would be. I mean, it was an adversary that you had to plan for and to be able to figure out how you're going to maneuver around it, if I could say it that. So it made you very, very good.
Is it easy to hang on someone else's wing in an F-15? Is it an airplane built around close-in formation?
Yeah, the airplane flies like a Cadillac. And I didn't fully appreciate that at the time, but as a test pilot, and you fly so many other airplanes, when you come back to the Eagle, you go, oh yeah, this is a Cadillac. Beautiful harmonized controls, very easy to fly. It's remarkable considering that airplane is a child of the late 60s, early 70s, just how well they got the flight controls dialed in. But yeah, it's very, very good to fly.
I don't think I'll ever forget that Tuesday morning in September of 2001. I was actually in Mass. I was in church here in Little Tullahoma.
Were you really?
I was. Yeah, I went to a Catholic school here, St. Paul's, and obviously, time zone difference between the East Coast and Central time where we are here. Left Mass is like the first hour of the morning, and went back to the classroom. TV was turned on, and it became very clear that I think the whole world had changed in a very big way on that day.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better place to be than being an air intercept pilot defending this country.
Yep.
That's where you were when the world changed. I was hoping maybe you could tell me that story.
Yeah, that day I was actually scheduled to go do a dogfight training mission. And I remember I woke up a little bit late that morning, and I needed to get to the squadron in time to, get set up for the brief and everything else that you got to go do in the world of aviation. I left home never having turned on the television, as was my habit at the time. On the way into work, I'm listening to like rock or something like that just to kind of get you pumped, because I'm like, I'm going to go do dogfight, whatever. And I got to the gate at the military base, and the sentry that was there checking IDs had, just like his eyes were as big as saucers, and you could tell something was up. And I could tell just based on the posture, because normally it was they just kind of wave you through, but this time they were actually like stopping everyone, looking at everything. And I was like, something's going on, right? And then by the time I got to the unit, I could see everyone kind of gathered in our, kind of like our ready room kind of area, and the television was on, and it was a picture of the World Trade Center on fire, one of the towers. And by the time I made it in, it was just prior to the second hit on the other tower. And so at that point, we see the impact, big mushroom cloud of fire and debris spraying everywhere and smoke going up. And at that point, it was pretty obvious that whatever this was deliberate, right? It wasn't an accident or anything else like that. And again, as F-15 drivers, I remember thinking, well, this is what we do, sort of, right? Like we keep the skies clear for everybody else. I had never in a million years ever thought that the opposing airplane, if I could say it that way, would be a hijacked airliner. And that was a bit terrifying. So I remember very clearly the squadron commander kind of walking in, and it's obvious now, right? But looking back on it, I just remember thinking, all training is done, right? Whatever was on the schedule today, it's over. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get the airplane's combat configured, because at that point, we might be the ones called forward to go intercept whatever other airliner might be. Because at the time, we didn't really know how many other airplanes might be sitting out there. And so that was our job. Our job was to protect the skies of Alaska. The part that was interesting for us in Alaska is, in addition to protecting, the city and the airspace and all those other sorts of things, was the pipeline is there, the Valdez pipeline. And so there was an interesting kind of dynamic there about, energy supply for the U.S. So we had that mission to go do as well. So what was supposed to be just a normal benign day, right, became very eye-opening in terms of, hey, this is for real now. This is a real-world attack against the homeland. And you are now an F-15 driver in an F-15 squadron with this mission to protect the skies of the United States in this case. And so, are you up for it? So that became, the squadron stood up, multiple day ops to be able to execute those missions. What was really fascinating is, again, it's Alaska. So there are many, many places where to get there, you can only get there by airplane. And there were a whole series of folks that were hunters and fishermen that somewhere on September 9th or whatever, they flew out to the Alaskan bush. They got left for however many days. The pilot told them, hey, meet me at this lake at this point. I'll come back. I'll come pick you up. Well, because we had grounded all air traffic, they never came back. And because they're in the Alaska bush, they don't have newspapers, radio is few and far between, no cell phone coverage at the time. And so they had no idea what happened. So a couple of days later, when air traffic had been reopened again and people could go back out again, all of the bush pilots, they would take newspapers with them and put them in the back of the airplane so that when they picked up their hunters or whatever, they could go, hey, here's the reason why I wasn't able to come back and I couldn't communicate with you about how come I wasn't showing up. So even though you got stranded, if you will, sitting out here, let me tell you how the world changed, because they're completely cut off from all of that. So it's kind of an interesting story of, flying up in Alaska.
So I'm guessing probably a very formative time, flying the F-15.
Yeah.
Good Lord, 9/11, like it doesn't get more formative than that for a young combat aviator.
Yep.
But what was the ethos is a term we throw around. What was kind of that spirit of the, from the Navy side, we'd say spirit of the wardroom, like where's everyone's mindset pointed at that point?
What I remember showing up in my first squadron, I picked Alaska mainly because from a geographic location, it was the most exotic, at least to me, right? Of, you're young. When are you going to get a chance to do something like that again? That's why I picked it. Why I love it to this day, because it absolutely lived up to its reputation of just being a fantastically gorgeous place to go fly. But what I remember to this day was just the men and women that you served with in that unit. I've heard kind of this sentiment from like Navy SEALs, for instance. I sat and chatted with them a little bit about just kind of their feelings about being on the teams. That same dynamic, I felt, was the same that I had in my first squadron, what we call it in the Air Force. Those men and women are people that I communicate with to today. I just even chatted with them last week, for a little bit on this stuff. They become like your brothers and sisters because you face so much danger and so much challenge, but you do it together. It cements and bonds you for life. Alaska was the first place I ever flew my first combat mission because we deployed to what was called Northern Watch at the time. And same thing, our job was to, make sure that the no-fly zones were enforced. And so it was our unit's rotation to go be a part of that mission. And I remember the night before your first combat mission, you got all these jitters, right, of, am I going to do something that's going to get someone else hurt? Am I going to cause a mission failure? Do I know everything I need to know about my airplane? Does everyone else know what they need to know about me? And so that we can operate effectively as a team. I remember being very, very just kind of keyed up about that. I couldn't sleep the night before. But I do remember getting a chance to go fly over northern Iraq, right? Our job then was to protect the Kurds from incursions from Saddam Hussein at the time. And I remember going across the line, from Turkey into northern Iraq. And I remember crossing that border. And I remember thinking at the time, this is the first time in my life flying where if something happens on the airplane and I have to do an emergency landing or I've got to eject, there's a better than average chance that the people that are coming to the wreckage are not there to help me. They're there to capture me, or whoever else might have to do that, someone else in my formation. So I remember just feeling this amazing heightened sense of all of like everything, my sight, my sound, the noises the airplane was making. I remember being very keyed into all of that because I remember thinking, I do not want to fail. I don't want to cause someone else to, and oh, by the way, if it's me sitting down there, I got to have everything dialed in terms of what are my procedures to get picked up, how am I going to evade, right? All these other different things that came along with it. And so I just remember being supremely conscious of every second of that mission and being so dialed in with the radio communications and formations and whatnot, whatever. So that mission stands out very, very clear in my mind to, flying in the F-15. And we actually did get shot at. It wasn't one of those things that was heavily advertised at the time, but Saddam's gunners were very much incentivized to at least take pot shots at the U.S. pilots and the Allied pilots just to show that they had done something for the cause. So it wasn't particularly well aimed fire, but it definitely was, explosions that were happening around the airplane that you had to evade and enforce, frankly, because then you'd look to see, well, what fired that? Where was it at? Can we return fire? What are the rules of engagements that go along with that? But I flew that first combat mission with my brothers and sisters in my squadron, and there will never, ever be a first combat mission ever again. And just the fact that you had that experience with those people is always very well cemented in my mind that, I have my biological family, obviously, but I have my Air Force family as well. And my squadron mates from the 19th Fighter Squadron, that 2000 to 2004 timeframe, were just fantastic people to serve with. Really enjoyed them.
You made a really great point. You're not worried about yourself.
Yeah.
That theme of we, not me.
Yeah.
I don't want to screw up, but I don't want to screw up because I don't want to hurt someone else, one of my teammates, someone on the ground.
Yep.
I don't know how you train that. I don't know how you get that ethos imbued in folks' identity. I think maybe they can hear stories and see other folks that maybe operate in that way.
Yeah.
But man, it is so powerful when everyone is fighting one another, not to look out for themselves, but to look out for the other, to look out for other people. So man, that doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, I love what Simon Sinek had to say on this, which is that in the military, we very much have this notion that I'm going to sacrifice so that you may benefit from it, right? Whereas maybe in some cultures outside of the military, it's the other way around. You're going to sacrifice so that I benefit, right? I'm going to step on top of you. With the fighter squadron, at least, it's inaccurate to say that your squadron is your coworkers, right? Very different kind of mentality on that. Your squadron, those are the people that you're friends with, that you hang out with, that as you have children, your children become friends with one another. Your mentors are a part of this. You learn so much about each other's lives, and that you're flying in an environment where if something happens to my airplane and I need help, it's going to be one of those people that are going to join up on my wing and help me get home and do everything possible to make sure, right? And in the event something bad were to happen, it's going to be those people sitting at my funeral trying to console my wife and family. That it's a bond that the only word I can describe it is brotherhood and sisterhood. That's the only word I can talk because they're not your coworkers, your suite mates, your office friends, or whatever, your colleagues. They're not. They're something deeper than that.
I think that's the thing that a lot of folks that leave the military kind of look back on fondly. I've had friends that have said, yes, I might be getting paid more, I might be enjoying this, that, or the other, but I miss the bros. And bros, by the way, being guys and girls, because you can be a girl and a bro. And I mean, then literally in the greatest way possible.
Yeah.
That's what they miss because, it in many ways doesn't, again, we love our biological family, we love the folks that we're married to and our kids and all that.
Yep.
But it's just a different relationship, but also just a wonderful one.
Yeah.
Okay. The Air Force has invested so much in you at this point, and they're going to invest some more because they're going to send you off to grad school and ultimately to be a test pilot. Hoping maybe you could tell me about that next.
So again, if I flash back to Mae Jemison, all right, and her stories of being an astronaut flying in space, I remember coming back from that talk from Mae Jemison, and I remember seeing some videos of different astronauts doing whatever else like that. And at the time, if you wanted to fly the shuttle, there was one way to do it, right? Be a fighter pilot, go to test pilot school, right? This is the way. So I knew going through my first operational tour that I wanted to go off and be a test pilot, which was kind of interesting because at that time, the ethos and the culture was you be a fighter pilot and you go to weapons school, right? That's where your future elite cadre of the combat Air Force goes, right? And I totally understand that. It makes a lot of sense. To say that you were going to be a combat aviator and then the next thing you wanted to go do was to be a test pilot was a little bit of we don't really talk about that out loud. We kind of keep that in your inside voice. We don't really say that out loud. I had a fantastic squadron commander at the time, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel at that time, Ken Wilsbach, now 4-star General Ken Wilsbach, cruiser. He was in my Mount Rushmore of leaders. His face is clearly carved into the mountainside, right? There's not many faces up there, but his is one of them. And the thing I always remember about him was I told him, hey, sir, I've been having thoughts as a fighter pilot that I want to go off into the test community and I want to be a test pilot. And I remember I was sitting in the room with him and he kind of put his arm over my shoulder and was like, that's great. The Air Force needs test pilots as well, just the same as you need fighter weapons school guys, because he was a fighter weapons school grad himself, right? And so I can appreciate that what I was telling him might not have sat well with him. But he said, hey, if that's what you want to do, I want to be a full supporter in that. And how can I help, right? And then he described some interactions that he's had with the test community and some things that, hey, this is messed up in the F-15 and let's go fix it. And, how you can have a great legacy and an impact on the technology that's coming up. And Alaska was was a great place for a young guy that wanted to be a test pilot because we had all the cool technology at the time. It sounds kind of trite and funny, but our jets had a UHF and a VHF radio, right? Which to an Eagle at that time was ooh, right? Because all we had was UHF in a lot of other places. We were the first guys to get the joint helmet mounted cueing system, right? Like all these kinds of technologies that were new for Alaska, mainly because our mission was so at the leading edge, right? And so Colonel Wilsbach at the time was very much in the mode of, if that's what you want to go do, I support you. Let's go make it happen, right? And I just remember like the stress melting away going, hey, my boss accepts me here, right? In this priesthood of, fighter aviation culture that I said, I don't want to go to weapons school. And it wasn't a dig against weapons school. I think it's a fantastic place. I just knew that for my career path where I wanted to end up, I needed to be a test pilot to even stand a chance at competing to go do that. So I apply. Again, this goes back to the make them tell you no, as opposed to getting completely psyched out by yourself. And so I apply to that school thinking fully that, well, no one gets accepted on their first shot. This is just, hey, you're just a little warm up round, go through. I got accepted on the first shot. And along with that, they gave a program where you could get your graduate degree, for me, aeronautical engineering, but they would send you off to grad school. And then on the back end of grad school, your thesis for your master's program is exactly what your capstone project would be at the test pilot school. So those two things marry up together. And it was a great way for 1 + 1 to equal 5. And so I got accepted into that program. So completely shocked, bowled over that it worked, but to what Mae Jemison taught me, make those people tell you no. Don't tell yourself no, right? Put your application, because you never know, right? You never know what's the rest of the competition, what are the dynamics going on. So I did that and got accepted. And so I went from Alaska and I hung up my spurs as a fighter pilot for a little bit and immediately went back to the world of engineering grad school and brought out the TI-92 calculator and started talking about eigenvectors and all these other kind of wacky, weird stuff and getting into the world of MATLAB, which was a pretty gigantic transition. But again, that same ethos I got from the Air Force Academy of, work hard, diligent, put nose to the grindstone. And that same level of, you will not defeat me, Eagle mentality of that culture was really helpful coming to grad school because you got to go from 0 to 100 and you got to do it really, really quickly just to get back into that flow again.
And I might have missed it. Where'd you go to grad school?
So I did it at what's called the Air Force Institute of Technology. So it's in Dayton, Ohio. It's our grad school, if you will, for the Air Force. Very challenging school as well.
So 1 year, 2 years, how long is it going through AFIT?
I was there for about a year and a half when I went through. And again, you leave AFIT and you don't have your master's yet. So you have all of your pre-work done, but then you need to go to test pilot school, which is another year on top of that. And then when you graduate out of test pilot school, they combine your master's work with your test pilot school work, and those two combine together to get you your master's degree. And for me, aeronautical engineering.
I've been so lucky to talk to so many folks that have gone to Naval Test Pilot School at Pax River. I've never, I think one gentleman who's gone to Air Force Test Pilot School. So I know basically nothing about it. What's the program like? What's that year? I'm guessing it's probably a lot of time just sitting around the golf course.
Oh, completely. Completely. Yeah,
a lot of spare time.
Yeah. So test pilot school, we call it at least getting like a master's or a PhD in aviation. It is extraordinarily, it is very, very tough. Very, very tough. Extremely long days. You'll fly a mission and then you'll come back and have to write, a whole technical report on everything that you just learned out of that mission. So we talk about performance of the airplanes, we talk about flying qualities, we talk about systems and avionics, and that curriculum is constantly evolving as you go through. The thing about test pilot school is once you get there, because it's fascinating, on the outside you could be, hey, this person was the top graduate of this program or that, this person was, the best in their squadron, this person went to all these different Ivy League kind of whatever, and you would kind of rise to the top in kind of like quote unquote normal Air Force, if I could call it that. And then when you apply to something like test pilot school, you realize all of your classmates are of that same strata of folks. So suddenly what looked like extraordinary stuff is just kind of average, right? And so the bar goes way up of, hey, if you want to be in that strata and you want to stand out, you really have to work because everyone around you has been like a top graduate of whatever program 5 times over. It happens so frequently, it's kind of comical at a certain level. So you realize that when you're looking in your class that you're looking around at other pilots from various communities, bomber community, cargo, whatever. And whoever they were probably, if not the best, at the very top strata, top 1 or 2% or so of whatever career field they came from. And now you're all mixed together when you go through that. So test pilot school is at Edwards Air Force Base, California, storied location. It's just one of those places, one of those Air Force bases that has an absolute like mythos and an ethos behind it. I used to call it, when you step outside at Edwards Air Force Base and you look up at the sky, you are looking at a cathedral to aviation. It's almost like the Sistine Chapel. You could look up and go, that's where the sound barrier was broken. That's where the XB-70 flew. That's where the space shuttle, did its final turn and landed on the dry lake bed. That's where, so all of these different milestones that happen that you can see on YouTube nowadays or various History Channel shows, that happened in the skies above Edwards Air Force Base. And so immediately when you walk up to a place like the Test Pilot School, you're joining this story, this unbroken storyline of first, right? Like higher, faster, further, right? All those things that go with it. You're joining that. And so in your mind, you again, it's another step up, right? 104 to 0. And, low B to the one of you that ruins that. You're joining the test pilot cadre there. There's an expectation that you're going to be on the furthest, highest advanced kind of airplanes, that the nation depends on you and that you got to get it right. And so the curriculum at Test Pilot School was grueling, very, very difficult to get through, because you got to be an academic. You got to be a communicator, you got to be an engineer, and you got to be a pilot. You got to do all those at the same time. And you got to be able to work in teams, because it's impossible to achieve everything just by yourself. That's not how it's built. And so you got to be able to work with civilians, government civilians. You got to be able to work with contractors, other military folks, all to be able to figure out if this airplane or this system is actually viable. And so it's really fascinating.
Are there folks that struggle to find that balance? Because you mentioned, like you said, you're surrounded by some of the greatest folks in all their fields that are picked, just like you, to go to test pilot school. Are there folks that have maybe a bit of a challenge living in that new world, or do people all kind of coalesce and come together by the time?
So everybody's got something, right, that they struggle with. The test pilot school curriculum will find that. So maybe you're a fantastic aviator, but you can't write to save your life, right? Because you're an engineer. Maybe you're a great engineer, but you're not really good on the social side. Maybe, like all those different things that have to come together.
That's a shock, sir, by the way. I've never
completely.
heard of engineers that have...
Completely.
As an engineer, yes.
Nerds unite, United States. That's right. It's good. The curriculum will find that weakness or flaw. And if you're not aware of it, it will make it very apparent to you. And same thing, right? Now the nice thing is, when you get there, the test community is very, very small, extremely, extremely small. One of the smallest communities in the entire U.S. Air Force. So the people that you go through that curriculum with are going to be same thing, almost like your squadron, if you will, your brothers and sisters. No matter which community you go to do test work after that, you all know one another. And it's a very, very tiny community. So for that reason, there is an incentive to, hey, we're going to figure this out together, because there's going to be long interactions long after test pilot school is over. So if you start building hatred and malcontent against one another, you're going to have to live with that person for the next couple of years of your life, and it's not the right thing to go do.
There is a stable of airplanes, and even some guest airplanes that kind of come in that you get to fly. I'm hoping maybe you could tell me about some of them, because there are some, I've seen some photos, really cool aircraft you get to be exposed to.
So this is the phase, I think, when test pilots die and go to heaven. This is the phase that I think heaven would look like for a test pilot, because they call it the qualitative evaluation phase, qual-eval. And picture it like this. They'll tell you, like I'll always remember this, because I always wanted to fly this airplane, but I was too young to get a chance to do it. They showed up on one day and said, hey, tomorrow you're going to fly an F-4, and they give you the -1, if you will, and you got to read through this. And the expectation is, all right, tomorrow morning you're going to show up, you're going to get the brief, we're going to go through this, we're going to put you in the front seat, and you got it, right? And you're going to evaluate the F-4 for whatever mission that it needs to go do, right? So, we pick some mission like, surface attack or low level or air-to-air or something like that, and you have to evaluate the airplane qualitatively in the environment that it came from. It's cool because you don't really have a lot of prep, right? Like in pilot training, they go, here's your T-37. You're going to fly this for months and months and months and months. You're going to take all these simulators and all these academics, right, to be able to make sure you're ready for it. You're going to practice whatever else like that. And then by the time you make it all the way through your career where you have the bona fides to be a test pilot, they just go, hey, tomorrow you're flying the F-4. Tomorrow you're flying a Goodyear blimp. After that, you're going to go fly a MiG-15. Then you're going to go fly a HU-16 Albatross, and you're going to land on the water. So it gets you very, very good at adapting to something that you're not very familiar with, and to be able to just kind of distill everything down to just the essentials. Like, what are the things I absolutely need to know to be able to get through this and to be able to understand, how to operate this system? I loved it. It was, back to the analogy of the Willy Wonka chocolate factory. By the time we left test pilot school, all of us had somewhere around between 25-ish, somewhere around there, maybe about 30 for some, of just different airplanes that you get a chance to go fly. I mean, we had some of my classmates that flew a U-2, some of the classmates that flew a B-52. And so you go through all these different things specifically designed to put you in uncomfortable scenarios in vehicles that you're not familiar with, right? So we would take our cargo pilots and we'd put them in fighter jets, and we'd take our fighter pilots and we put them in cargo airplanes, so that you learn the crew concept of, pilot flying, pilot not flying, and that's weird and strange and different. But we use that as an analog to say, hey, when you graduate and you go off to whatever unit that you're going to go to, you're going to be evaluating a new system, a new weapon, or whatever that has never flown before. And you're going to be the person there to have to make a decision about what needs to get fixed on it, or how. And to be able to do that, the analog is to go, okay, we're taking you on a trip. You're going to go to, like, we went to Navy test pilot school and we flew some of the helicopters they had. And I got a little bit of time in an F-15 and just all the Navy life support gear and how that's so different from the Air Force life support gear, and, the terminology. And it was all different and weird and strange, but it's to intentionally put you in that position so that you get very good at it. I tell folks, for the uninitiated, one of the shows I watched as a kid was A-Team coming up, and there was a character in there called Murdoch, right? Murdoch was this crazy, literally, they made this analogy that all pilots are crazy, right? Because Murdoch was crazy. But Murdoch in the TV show, Murdoch could fly anything. Murdoch was a pilot, right? He wasn't necessarily a fixed wing pilot, he was a pilot, right? And so whatever the A-Team needed, Murdoch could fly it. The qualitative evaluation period in test pilot school, that was like, be Murdoch for a couple months of your life and fly anything that shows up, which was, I wish I could do that again all over again, because that was just a great time.
Well, you mentioned the Phantom.
Yeah.
I've never talked to anyone that's flown an Air Force Phantom.
Yeah.
What was that flight like?
I had the same feeling flying the B-52, which was, some airplanes are good airplanes, right? Some airplanes are iconic, right? Like, this is Air Force history, right? The Buff was very much that way. The F-4 to me was very much that way. I'd grown up on stories of Robin Olds and all the different stories that occurred in Vietnam, this, that, and the other. And so to sit in the F-4 cockpit, you immediately felt like you were sitting in something that was an iconic, historic. Plus, the airplane itself has a very unique look to it. I mean, things are bent in all types of weird angles, and it's just a very bizarre kind of looking jet, but it has a very unique kind of signature to it. And so to say that, and when you look at the tail numbers, I mean, the tail numbers are 1960s or whatever, and you don't know the full story of the history of these airplanes, but there's a good chance that this thing might have flown in some combat theater that you're aware of and done something along the way. So you sit in this airplane and immediately you get the sense of, I'm touching history. And then you realize that the F-4, it flies as funky as it looks, right? Like, it's got some weird quirks to it. Leading edge slats will deploy here and flaps there, and sometimes it starts maneuvering around. You start realizing that for the Steve Ritchies of the world in the Air Force, or the Robin Olds, or the Duke Cunninghams right on the Navy side, for them to go out and get all these air-to-air kills in this airplane, you had to work for it, right, in that airplane. The Eagle, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, flew like a Cadillac. I think, because again, they're both McDonnell Douglas airplanes, and I think a lot of the sins of the F-4 were fixed on the F-15. And so by the time guys like me showed up, it's like, oh yeah, all airplanes fly like this. What's the problem, right? And then you get to the F-4 and you realize, wow, this is a little bit squirrely. It will bite you, and it's got a lot of quirks and features that to then go take this thing off of a carrier or whatever else in the F-4 and to go out and to go kick the crap out of some other airplane like a MiG-21 or something. I mean, you had to fly the F-4 to get it to do what you want it to go do. I ended up having just an immense respect for all the F-4 air-to-air combat, victories, because you start realizing that was work, right? You needed to be an aviator. You had to be a pilot, right, to be able to get that airplane to do what you wanted to go do.
Painting the other corner, you mentioned the MiG. What was flying the MiG like?
The MiG was actually a surprise, because as much as we say, oh, it's, this old Russian piece of crap built by, whatever, for farmers, whatever, I was actually amazed. So what we call a control harmony, like the aileron and the elevator kind of, it was very well harmonized. It flew very, very well. I was really amazed by that. But what was fascinating is you see how a different culture, a different design philosophy, I mean, it's all airplanes, right? They're all airplanes. But to see how that was done in the former Soviet Union, right, compared to what its equivalent would have been on the American side, like an F-86, for instance, it's actually amazing just how different approaches they took to it. So, for instance, the brakes in a MiG-15, it's like a handbrake on the stick, right, as opposed to pedals on the floor. So you have to, and it sounds like an old train, like it goes psh, psh, as you're on the runway and you're trying to stop and you're pushing this handbrake to get it to stop. And if I remember correctly, the stick in the MiG-15 was very, very tall, mainly so that you had mechanical advantage with your arm to be able to get the airplane to move the flight controls when they're under load at high speeds, which is a different approach than what we would have done in, the American military, which is that we would have had hydraulically boosted flight controls to go do that. So again, they made it for a different design philosophy, which is I got to mass produce these things. They're predominantly an interceptor kind of mission. And in the event they break, they got to be able to be repaired by people that may not necessarily have, a long tradition of, going to like maintenance school and having this very advanced kind of well-supported infrastructure. You got to be able to fix it with like sledgehammers and baling wire. And so they built it to be pretty rugged and tough that way, but very easily fixable.
There's one sortie, one flight, and I'm asking you to, like we say, pick a favorite child. There isn't such a thing. But one flight from test pilot school that really summed it all up. Maybe everything coalesced and you thought, yeah, I've got the skills, I've got the knowledge, I'm ready to go out and do this for real for the Air Force. Yeah. Was there a flight that felt that way for you?
It might sound weird, but one of the things that we did, because it was so far off the beaten path, right? Because, by the time you go through test pilot school, you've flown everything from DC-3s, tail dragger airplanes, right, that have they're beautiful airplanes, but they had really weird handling dynamics at the time. You've flown things like that. I remember we went over to Sweden and we flew the Jaskrippen 39 simulator that was there, and we did some stuff with the Viggen, the gorgeous airplane. I loved flying the Viggen. But the one that was so far in left field by far was the Goodyear blimp. We had this kind of neat arrangement because, Edwards is just north of Los Angeles. And so, Goodyear is, down in LA, and they brought us down there, right? And so they brought some of the class and we got a chance to go sit there. And first of all, you look at this thing and go, nothing I've done in my life has ever prepared me for this, because it doesn't fly anything like a rotary wing or a fixed wing or whatever. It's using buoyancy, if you will, in the air. So that's the first thing. You kind of look at this thing and go, ooh, this is going to be interesting. The second thing you notice is how it's actually launched, right? Because it takes a small army of people to be able to man the ropes, right, as they get this thing ready for takeoff. So it's this coordinated dance between the crew inside the blimp and then also everyone kind of sitting on the outside about when to let go of ropes. Because again, you don't want someone holding on to this thing and it gets airborne and now this guy's 20, 30 feet in the air and he can't let go, right? And so what do you do there, right? So just watching the coordination that happened then, and then just realizing that the deck angle of this thing, when it climbs out and it's steep, I'm a fighter pilot. I'm used to the max performance takeoff. You get to the end of the runway, full afterburner, go 90 degrees up and whatever else, and you're just zorching away like a rocket ship. For the Goodyear, it was hilarious because it almost had that same deck angle, like it's climbing pretty steep, but it's moving at like 10 miles an hour, right, with the engines at full power. And you're looking at this thing and like, that's a steep deck angle with the engine screaming, but there's no movement out of it, right? So it goes really slow. So very quickly, that vehicle, the engines can pivot themselves. So you can actually steer it like a tank, like the old where you put like one tank tread to go forward and the other tank tread to go backwards. And so you can pivot this thing mid-flight. You can shut down the motors in flight because, again, it's not relying upon the motors to generate lift. It's using the bag right above the gondola to stay there. So I remember there was a spot in the flight where we were completely shut down, dead in the water, if you will, sitting over top of LA, totally silent, and just looking around going, wow, this is different. And you got to be very mindful of, as you change altitudes, because you don't want to burst the bag. And so, there's all these different dynamics that happen. And, rather than having a yoke or whatever, you had rudder pedals and you had a gigantic trim wheel. So if you wanted to go up, you would push the trim wheel one way, and if you want to go down, the trim wheel the other way. But it didn't have the standard flight controls that you and I are used to be able to go do that. And then there's a very, very small community of folks that are blimp, so like Fujifilm or Goodyear, right? So they all know one another, and it's a tiny community. So one, just getting a chance to fly that. Two, the culture that it was in. And then three, just realizing that, hey, this is probably the most unusual vehicle that I'll ever get a chance to go fly, because nothing flies like this. But in a certain spot, you just started to feel pretty comfortable in it, just because, again, you'd spent a year by that point just kind of going, all right, this is how this one taxis. This is how you start this one up. This is how you fly. These are the systems here. And you put all that together and go, yeah, I think I can understand this, even though it's so far out in left field compared to what you've seen before. So I definitely remember that. That was probably hands down my favorite qual eval, was just getting the chance just to go fly with Goodyear.
Okay, done with test pilot school. You've got the certificate. You're a qual, as they say in the Navy.
Yeah.
Where'd you go next?
So after that, I got assigned to the 40th Flight Test Squadron, which is at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida.
Very familiar to me, right?
Yeah.
Right
Yeah.
across the
Right down the
airspace
street.
and the
Yeah,
range.
completely.
Yep. What'd you fly at Eglin?
Eglin was fantastic. They were very, very good to me. I will always be grateful for the leadership there. I returned back to the Eagle because we did F-15 C model testing at that point, but in kind of a nice... If we go back to pilot training, they basically tell you, you can pick one airplane. Right, pick one, and that's going to be your airplane effectively for life is kind of the way they lead you down there. But, like any time when you have to choose, like, do you want the Porsche or do you want the Ferrari, right? If you choose one of the two, you're always going to wonder, like there's a part of your head that goes, yeah, the Ferrari's cool, but what would it have been like to do the Porsche? And it's always the thing that got away. When I got to Eglin, I got back to the F-15C model, but then I also got to fly the sister airplane of the F-15C, which is the F-15E model. They look kind of the same on the outside, but they're actually very, very different airplanes. They're both called Eagle, but one's a Strike Eagle, right? And one's an Eagle. And getting the chance to see that was kind of cool. And then the other thing I got a chance to fly when I was at Eglin was the A-10 Warthog. I call it kind of like the cousin to the F-15C model in the sense that it's twin-tailed, twin-engine, single-seat, single mission. A Formula One race car, if you will, optimized and built for one purpose only. And so the same ethos that went into the C-model Eagle of not a pound for air-to-ground, in the Warthog, it was just the opposite. Like, this airplane is going to be the best close air support machine on the planet. Can't do much else. But that one thing that it does, it is going to be better than anybody else on the planet. So it's the superlative. So every C-model Eagle driver understands kind of that same culture. Like, because again, to Warthog drivers, it was the priesthood of close air support and that bond between that airplane and the quote unquote grunt right on the ground, the Marine or the Army soldier that needed that Warthog to be able to provide that close air support to be able to help them. So I loved getting a chance to see a little bit of that culture as well, transitioning and being a Warthog guy for a bit.
Air to ground. I was going to say that's probably a world that at that point you really hadn't lived in at all.
Yep.
Okay, so I don't even know what the training syllabus is like. As a test guy, is it a little bit kind of a shorter syllabus that you go through? Okay.
Yeah, so they put you through what we call our senior officer course, which is it gets you just enough training so that you understand how to fly this thing, from an instrument perspective, right? But all the mission stuff that comes along with that, you get that later. So you go through the academics, you go through the simulations, and then you get to what we call in the Air Force our Form 8 check ride, which says that you are now qualified in this airplane, and then, there might be some limitations of, well, you can do this, but you can't do that. You got to go get additional training to get you through that. So we got that. At the time, it was at Barksdale is where I went through the training. Yeah, it was weird, right? Because there was a small unit there. There, it's known for B-52s, but at the time, there was a small A-10, training unit that was there that I went through and loved those guys as well. And it was just a lot of fun. The Warthog, to me, I loved flying that airplane because, again, it was just built in that same ethos of the C-model Eagle. Like, we just do everything perfect here. But I loved this notion of a seemingly indestructible airplane because there was always this stories of it would take battle damage and bring you home just fine. Only airplane I've ever flown where it could lose all its hydraulics and it still had another way to get you home, right? And so I just loved, it was this notion that most other airplanes I've ever flown, they're built with this idea of I'm going to avoid taking battle damage because I'm faster, I'm higher, I got great sensors around me, I can avoid, and et cetera, et cetera. The Warthog, I kind of view it as whenever it was called into action, it was going to arrive into a middle of a knife fight already in progress, right? So the notion was it was going to get stabbed, right? It was definitely going to take damage. And so how do you build an airplane that is resistant and fault tolerant for that? Like, as an engineer and as a nerd, the design theory of that, I kind of went, that's amazing, right? You talked about the titanium bathtub and all the different redundancies that were on that system. Plus, the other thing I thought was kind of cool about the Warthog, it was the only airplane, modern airplane, I should say, where the primary weapon was the gun. 100%, right? It had a lot of other weapons on it, but it would show up as a gunslinger to begin with because that 30 millimeter cannon was otherworldly. It was therapy for fighter pilots to get a chance to go shoot that thing. It was nice because in the Eagle, right, in the C-model Eagle, if you're down to the gun, a lot of things have gone wrong. Now, you're still going to kick the crap out of them because you're a better dogfighter, your airplane's better, you're better trained, and you're going to come back and you're going to, not say, I shot that guy with the gun. But if you got like a real world engagement, if it got down to the spot where you were using the gun, it's because everything else up until that point had failed or didn't work the way it was supposed to. So that would have been a debrief item is what we call in the C model. In the A-10, that's what you led with, right, was the gun.
The point of Eglin, the reason that range complex exists is air-to-air, air-to-ground ordnance.
Yep.
Right? So I'm guessing you talked about the A-10, the F-15, F-15E.
Yep.
What have you had come off a jet?
Just about anything and everything. So the nice thing of being a test pilot at Eglin in those days is you flew a lot. And you got a chance to your point, the great value add to the test community of a place like Eglin is that weapons development side of it. So you might not necessarily have been looking so much at the airplane per se, but you were looking at the weapon that sat on the airplane and then the integration between the airplane and the weapon, how well they talked to one another. So, it didn't happen often, but there were a couple of times in my tour at Eglin where you'd start off in the morning on the C model Eagle doing some tests. By lunchtime, you're flying the Strike Eagle. And then by evening, just to kind of, put the sauce on it, you get a chance to go fly the A-10 out to the range, right? And go do something out there with it. It was a fun place. I am supremely grateful to my time at Eglin there for that reason, because kind of like being a C model driver in Alaska, where I got exceptionally good at being comfortable flying in dark, really crappy weather conditions onto really slick runways, and you just get really, really good at that. Flying off the Gulf Coast in Florida with all those different platforms and all those different weapon systems that were there, you got very, very good at just kind of, okay, what do we need to do today? What's this going to go do? How are we going to set this up? You had a fantastic team that was built around you. And so you just got very, very good at, okay, I got to go do the E model. Okay, and the E model is sort of like the C. I got to remember these different changes to the checklist. Okay, go do this, go do this. Okay, now go, right? And just go. And then you could just immediately, it's almost like the Atari video game systems where you'd pull out the cartridge for Defender and you would put in Pac-Man and turn the power on and suddenly you're now Pac-Man. So you got very good at that of, okay, I'm a Warthog dude. All right, so I got to remember this. Put the thing in the cartridge, turn the power on. Behold, you're now a Warthog guy. So I was always grateful for that. But yeah, we dropped smart weapons, all different types of air-to-air missiles. We did go do some training on the guns for the various different platforms, so you got a chance to fire that. So it was a hoot, right? I mean, you're living in Florida, beautiful beaches, right? It was great fishing town and sailboats and that water culture that goes around it. And oh, by the way, you're getting a chance to go fly those types of airplanes and those types of profiles with a team that was so fantastic around you. I got all types of love in my heart for Eglin.
You mentioned the team, and I think that's so important. You also mentioned the Eagle. When you stepped into the F-15 for the first time, that Cadillac, a lot of work had gone on by very smart people to make that airplane what it was.
Yep.
Now, as the test guy, you are the Air Force representative. You've obviously got the contractor that's building and developing and designing these things.
Yep.
But guess what? Without your say-so, without your approval, it's not going to get to that frontline aviator, that frontline fighter pilot, because guess what? You need someone that can speak both languages. What's it like interacting with the civilian side? Because I think the one thing that people, I'm just going to throw my tiny little editorial in here.
Please,
as both my folks work at Arnold Air Force Base, the folks that don't really appreciate, they just think it comes out of the box ready to go. And there's a very incredible population of folks in this country that are civilians that support our military. Support that I'm going to use the terrible term military-industrial complex, but very, very intelligent folks, some that were prior military, some that had no association with the military before at all. But they're the ones that are breaking out, I'm going to say slide rules. They're breaking out MATLAB. They're breaking out all these tools to sharpen that weapon and then hand it to a combat aviator like yourself that says, actually, maybe we need to tweak this or tweak that. And then you're the one handing it to the combat aviator to actually go out and do things.
Yep.
What's it like being that, I don't want to say middle layer, but being that the interface between those two worlds?
So I work for what's called Air Force Materiel Command, which in the Air Force, kind of think of it as we are the one, what we call a major command that supports every other major command that the Air Force has. Because at the end of the day, if you got to acquire whatever, some war-winning material, right? At some point, right, it's going to run through Air Force Materiel Command to go do that. Air Force Materiel Command is almost exclusively composed of civilians, almost exclusively. And the interactions I've had, because a lot of folks think, well, if you want to join the military, it means you got to go to boot camp and put on a uniform and, do pull-ups and push-ups at 5 a.m. and, climb through mud and whatnot. Oftentimes, what's not captured is that you can 100% be a part of the Air Force and be a civilian. And your uniform, per se, is your polo shirt and your slacks and whatever. But that means that you are still a vital part of our national defense, even if you don't, quote unquote, put on a uniform. And oftentimes that message gets lost because the narrative that we put out there is, well, military people are just the ones that put on uniforms. Not true. Not true, 100%. I would also tell you that the civilians that I've worked with, whether it was, all the different test locations or whatever, are some of the greatest patriots and Americans you will ever want to go see. So this narrative that government's bloated and, we pay these people, but they don't work and it's all bureaucracy, whatever. I get that stereotype. I understand it. However, the men and women that I've served with, in a lot of cases, some of them are actually prior prior uniform military themselves. Some of them have been career civilians all the way through. But to a man or to a woman, what I've experienced, at least in my life and times in Air Force Materiel Command, is that these are folks that, kind of like what we talked about as a young squadron member, where you look around and you see brothers and sisters because you face danger together. The people that I work with, I feel very much that same way as well, because these are men and women that are supremely intelligent, very capable. They could easily go do a number of other things with their lives and get paid, I'm not kidding, no hyperbole, 5 to 7, 10 times maybe, right? As much money as what they make now. But they've made a decision that they want to chase this particular purpose in their life over chasing a paycheck. And so when you get to a test squadron, not unusual in a test squadron that you'll see just a couple of uniformed military hanging around you and a lot of civilians, a lot of civilians. And you'll also, to your point, you'll see contractors that show up from the various different defense contractors that are helping develop whatever capability that's sitting out in front of you. So very quickly, one of the things I learned is don't pay so much attention to who's paying their paycheck or what their badge says. At the end of the day, we, right, in the Air Force, we consider, especially our government civilian cadre, quote unquote airmen, right? Like when we say airmen, we mean civilian as well, right? We just don't mean the military side of it. And that's an interesting kind of dynamic that happens in the test communities that you may not see in a lot of other places. Because at the end of the day, whatever system is going on my airplane, whatever weapons going on my airplane, chances are a government civilian touched that along the way. And if that person was incompetent, my life is at risk and, the safety of the vehicle is at risk. And so very quickly you learn that I'm placing my life in their engineering judgment, their thoughts or whatever. And the other part of that happens, and it's very unique to the test culture, is, this notion of your Chuck Yeager and you're going to go sit in your airplane and your orange, rocket powered jet, and you're going to be hitting the switches and you're going to be zorching along and it's just you, whatever. That is a bygone era. If you were to see a test mission nowadays, it looks like going to the moon. No kidding, because it's maybe you and maybe your crew in the airplane, but then you also have the airplane beaming off all of this data to ground control stations that are absorbing that. And then there's a control room that is filled with engineers, again, mostly civilian, some contractor, that are sitting out there that are watching every parameter of this airplane. And they know things about your airplane that maybe you don't, because, something's instrumented that you don't see, but I need them to be eyes and ears on that to be able to tell me what's going on, and vice versa. They're not in the airplane, so they might not feel the same thing that I just felt. And I got to be able to talk about that and relay that to them. So we function as a team, right? There might be just a few people in the airplane, but there's an entire army of folks that are operating that test mission together as one team, very much like in the way that you've seen on space missions. Very, very similar. In fact, the space culture, I think, brought a lot of that over from the test community, because that first cadre of astronauts were all testers, right? And, to build a mission control, it looks a lot like kind of what we do for test missions. So very similar ethos there.
I always like to ask about mentors and friends and folks that you learned from. I'm guessing at Eglin there were probably one or two, be it civilian, be it military. Maybe hoping you could tell me about one of them, just someone that's who I want to be as a test guy. Because again, you're a new graduate of the test pilot school at that point. You're still kind of coming to learn what you want to do and what value you want to bring. Anyone there down in Florida that you still think of today?
There was. So one of my squadron commanders down there was a guy named Magoo Miller. And Magoo was a fantastic guy. What I remember the most from him was, even beyond just the prowess of being a test pilot, it was being a leader. I don't think there's ever been a time I've ever seen Magoo where he didn't have a megawatt smile on his face, right? Like he looked like a kid on Christmas Day whenever he walked in the door. And it was one of those types of folks where no matter how you were feeling, he would walk in the door and immediately like the mood of the place would kind of elevate up, just because he just inspired that level of trust and confidence and energy into whatever environment. And so again, for all of his competence as a pilot and everything that, he did just as a test pilot, if you will, the thing I always remember from him from a mentorship standpoint is just how the culture and ethos of an organization will pick up on whoever's leading it. And so, the old analogy we had is the commander is the weatherman, which is an interesting kind of take. It's to say that if it's a bright, sunny day outside and you walk in and go, man, I hate bright, sunny days and how terrible is this, whatever else, I can't stand this anymore. The organization will pick up on that, and suddenly they're going to hate bright and sunny days because the weatherman walked in and declared that these are just terrible days, right? Vice versa, if you can walk in on a cloudy day and go, you know what? It's good life, man. I like being here. This is good. There's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, to adapt to that weather. It's good, man. The organization will pick up on that as well. And so Magoo was one of those types of folks that you just loved to fly with because, again, he was supremely competent in that domain. But then when he was out of the cockpit, I think that's when he was really at his game because he just inspired a lot of folks to come up to that level. And I always remembered that about him.
If you want life to suck, it will suck.
That's right. Exactly.
You have to make that decision, that choice. You want things to be good.
Yeah.
You want to take care of your people.
Yep.
Okay, there's an acronym. People are going to think it's a breakfast treat if I just say BACN, but Battlefield Air Combat Node. BACN is something that's relatively new to the Air Force, relatively new mission system.
Yep.
I know basically nothing about it other than it's a global, I think. Tell me about BACN.
Yeah, so it's a Battlefield Airborne Communication Node. So BACN.
Not even close. Communications. Thanks.
Yeah, so Battlefield Airborne, but same kind of idea. This was one of those points where I wasn't expecting this. I was having a great time at Eglin flying the Eagle, right, both variants, and then flying the Warthog. And then one day, we're sitting kind of in our ready room or whatever, what we call our group commander, which is the commander that's above the squadron level, was sitting there and gets a cell phone text of the Air Force is looking for an initial cadre of people to take this new capability to the combat zone. And, we're going to build this mix of operational pilots and test pilots because we want to make sure that we're guaranteeing the most amount of success for this program, right, walking out the door. I knew at the time that I was getting fairly close to a deployment, like I knew that was coming up for me. And so, I saw the group commander kind of look at us and kind of do the old, oh, that's interesting. I wonder, and I heard him kind of talk about this out loud and like, even without really thinking about it or even talking to my family about it. Yes, sir, I'll do that. If you need someone to go, I'll absolutely do that. And so he's like, okay. And so they went through a couple of different, hey, who do we want to send? What makes the most amount of sense? I did eventually talk to my family about it. But it was this notion of going over to the Middle East and getting a chance to fly this airplane and to bring this capability. What I really loved about it was the idea of supporting the troops on the ground because, some areas there were extremely mountainous. Radio communications could only go so far because things are blocked, line of sight. And the idea was take this airplane that was built for a similar mission, right? Fly at altitude for very long durations. But rather than do it in the way that super wealthy folks do with this business jet and they're flying from point A to point B, this was go sit over top of an area at very, very high altitudes and to be like a radio communications relay so that so long as you had line of sight to my airplane had line of sight to the world, right? Because I could talk to satellites and whatever. And it didn't matter what type of radio you had. My jet could translate that and take one frequency and convert it to another and be able to communicate back and forth. It was a fantastic mission. One as a fighter pilot and as a test pilot, getting to get a chance to get qualified and get a type rating on this global jet, which is very high-end business jet. Beautiful, right? Again, as an engineer and a dork and a nerd, as I look around that airplane, I go, oh, I love how they made that wing. And I totally get how they set up the engines to be able to have a certain amount of fuel. Like, you totally nerded out on the airplane, but you realize very much in the same way as the Warthog or the C model Eagle that it is a very much Formula One race car built for that particular mission. It does that mission of transport extraordinarily well. And it just so happened that all those same characteristics that made it nice for that was the same thing that we needed to go do this mission, right? So it worked out particularly well. So I got a chance to learn the heavy world as a fighter pilot, about the pilot flying and pilot not flying and how to run a checklist when there's an emergency going on and crew coordination and all of those sorts of things that we sort of see in the fighter world, but it's different when you got two people that are both pilots flying one airplane, right? And just learning that coordination from there. So I look back on that was my second combat tour. So my first combat tour was in the Eagle C model, and then now my second combat tour was in the BACN jet as a test pilot. We built hundreds and hundreds and hundred hours of flight time flying that mission. And it was great because initially when we got to the combat theater of operation, no one really knew who we were. The jet was very prototypey. At that point, our first couple missions, nothing really worked the way it should have. And so as a team, we had to figure out all the little interesting, how do you get this payload to turn on and what altitude do we need to go to and how do we set up our conditions to go fly? And you're doing all this, oh, by the way, while you're getting shot at right on the ground and amazingly, atrociously bad weather conditions with, dust storms and whatnot rolling through. You're doing it in austere conditions. But I loved every second of it, right? Because it was, what's the best way to describe it? It was sort of like basic training, right? Like in basic training, you arrive and it's miserable for everybody. And because it is, it's the most extraordinary experience because you're sharing that together. And it's a shared hardship that builds a certain trust. That team of men and women that I deployed with for that first BACN deployment as the initial cadre, I feel very much the same way about them, right? And that experience. Because again, it was tough living conditions, but we did it together. It was this weird jet that didn't make a lot of sense, but we figured it out, right? We built the tactics for it, and then now that became, the program that you see today. But in the early days, it was very, very much experimental, and it wasn't a sure thing that would actually work. But man, oh man, what an amazing flying experience that was with the team that we had there. And again, all of the things that you built as a test pilot were perfectly adapted for that particular mission in the early days.
With the wind down in Iraq and Afghanistan and everything, things changing, just broadly, a little bit more globally there. Yeah. Do you think the airplane in that mission set has a future, or is it something that it was very niche?
I think it could.
And I want to say the Air Force is buying more of them right now, at least the last.
Yeah, so it's changing, right? So the mission's changing. Like in the old days, we only had one airplane. Right now, there's multiple. It's the only airplane I ever flew that all of my time in that airplane is exactly in that airplane, right? That tail number, that airplane, because we only had one at the time, but now there's multiple. So this notion of how do we still interconnect everything is still a very valid kind of thing. Now, ultimately what that looks like for the Air Force, I couldn't say. I do know, though, that airplane had gigantic influence for the missions that we used it for in the Middle East, and, saved a lot of lives, made missions far more efficient, kept ground troops connected in the way that they needed to. So it was definitely a valid, worthwhile mission. And we'll see how that morphs over time, right, in terms of what the Air Force wants to do with it.
Speaking of things morphing over time, we talked about the T-37, the T-38, the F-15.
Yeah.
F4 was in there a little bit too, but the F-22 Raptor. As a Navy guy, I think they're going to kick me out of the cool guy club if I say this, but I'll say it anyway. It is the most beautiful jet. I love the F-18. I have all of 2 flights in an F-18, and that was awesome. The Raptor's just something else.
Oh, yeah.
And I know at some point in the career, that's where you headed next. Tell me about the F-22.
Again, here's another side story for the listeners of faith. Is about the only way I can really describe it. Coming out of test pilot school, I was actually, so this is back in like 2006 timeframe or so. Coming out of test pilot school, I thought I was actually going to go to the F-22 Raptor. It was going to be great. I was going to be, fresh out of the F-15 world, go to test pilot school, go through that year. And at the back end of that, the prize, if you will, at the end was going to be a part of the F-22 unit, which was going to be glorious. At that point, there were a lot of, the Raptor was still relatively new and a lot of systems coming online. So I thought, hey, this will be great. And I'll get a chance to be a part of that. For a lot of things that happened in the military, it never came together, right? Just never happened. And so there's a part of you that was like, how glorious would that have been? Now, I got the consolation prize, which was go to Eglin, right, and fly the Warthog and fly the Strike Eagle. So I don't want anyone crying for me. It was awesome. I'm supremely grateful to Eglin for that. But there was always this little part in the back of my mind going, man, will I ever get there, right? Because again, if you go back to the priesthood of air superiority, right? The F-15 guys, in that day, that was the airplane to go to. Like, you needed to be very, very high end in your pilot training class to get selected to go to F-15 C model training. And as the Raptor came online, it kind of took the very best of the Eagle community, and they all transitioned over to the F-22. So that competitive nature in you of, could I get to the next thing, right? Like, the Eagle was the Dodge Charger of the 70s, right? And now the Raptor was like the new Dodge Charger, right? One of those, could you go fly that airplane? There was always that part of me that was like, man, I don't know if it's ever going to happen. Easily 13 years later, right? So again, I lived with that for a long time. Purely out of the blue. Didn't ask for it. Like, literally did not ask for it. I got a phone call that said, hey, we'd like you to come out and be what we call the director of operations for the F-22 test unit at Edwards Air Force Base. And it literally just fell in my lap, right? Like, you can maneuver and politic and scheme for it to come true. I didn't, right? I was fully expecting something else to happen. And through a lot of things that were happening behind the scenes that I had no play on, this was offered. And it was literally like manna from heaven, like, here, and like immediately that boyhood, like, all right, I get the chance to go fly Raptor, and how cool would that be, and how awesome. And it lived up to every single solitary bit of that. I joke a little bit about this, but George Lucas only had the imagination to make an X-Wing fighter, right? He was limited in his imagination by making an X-Wing fighter with R2-D2. If he had thought a little bit harder, he would have made a Raptor, because that's the airplane that would have blown up the Death Star. And, it is a starship. To your point, we have this saying in the test community that if the airplane looks good, it flies good. The Raptor looks great. And it doesn't matter what angle you look at it, right? Again, I'm an aero engineer by background and trade. My focus was in propulsion. And so to me, the most interesting thing of the Raptor is just looking at the engines and, how they go and play and the thrust vectoring that happens around back there. So it's weird. My favorite perspective of the Raptor is from behind, just because that's the perfect view of these gigantic motors, right, doing their thing and doing tremendous violence to air molecules as they get sucked down the engine and get shot out the back on fire. So the Raptor, to me, was a 100% dream come true that I always hoped that I would get a chance to be a part of. But at a certain point in my life, I just kind of, I was like, I don't know if this is going to happen or not, and if it doesn't, okay, it's been great career elsewise. But when it kind of just occurred, right, it was one of those, this is serendipity, right? Little signs of maybe future destiny and hope. So one, joining the Raptor community itself was beautiful, because it was like coming back home to that priesthood. It's just that you're coming back to it with a supremely more advanced airplane than what the F-15C was. But that same mentality of we have to be the very best on the planet on this was still there. And I really loved, right, that challenge of you asked to join us, right? Can you do everything this airplane can go do? So I don't know what else I could say about the Raptor other than to say it literally is a starship. I've been the fastest I've ever been in that airplane. I've been the highest I've ever been in that airplane. The things that as an Eagle driver, you needed to be an extraordinarily capable weapons school officer to get the airplane to maneuver in a certain way, because the Eagle just required a little bit of finesse to get it to peak performance, whatever it could do. The Raptor, just because the flight control system, how it was designed, the Raptor you could do almost on day one with very little experience in the airplane, that you could maneuver it with some level of abandon, if you will, and you knew that the airplane was never going to depart controlled flight, it wasn't going to over-G, and that you could peak perform the airplane because the flight controls were just designed beautifully, right, to get you right up to the edge of the performance without going off of a cliff. Just fantastically designed airplane.
This might be an odd kind of question or perspective, but I'll send it anyway. You've had that background. Again, you came from, I don't know, I still love the F-15. I think it's a beautiful looking airplane. I think it's going to go on to serve the Air Force well.
Yeah.
The EX is the next generation, right, that the Air Force is buying now. But even so, you came on with that as your foundation, right? And you appreciate the Raptor, I would say, maybe even so much more, because that's where you came from, learning to run that radar and learn to work as a foreship of Eagles. The folks that are, good Lord, so blessed and lucky. I got to go out to Hawaii recently. A good friend of mine's the CO of the unit out there. Yeah. And there was one of the pilots he mentioned, he goes, literally all they know is the T6, the T-38, and now the Raptor. Yeah. And it made me think, is that appreciation lost for some of that history, or is that something that the Air Force imbues in folks? And you've learned it through a whole career. You didn't just step right into the magic, so to speak. Yeah. Are we losing anything by having folks step right into the magic, or is it something that you've got the magic, so to speak? Yeah. And then now you're just so much better at that job of being a combat aviator because the Raptor makes you that, the F-35 makes you that, just because the airplane, again, it is so darn cool.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought. I would tend to think, so for instance, there were folks that, for my generation, they came up on the F4 and then they saw the Eagle, right? And went, oh, wow, look at this radar. It's pulse and Doppler. And wow, it can do,
does it all for you.
Yeah. So for that cadre, for young pilot training students to go directly into the Eagle, perhaps they missed out on the magic of what it meant to fly the F4. But then the F4 drivers maybe had greater appreciation for what the Eagle was because they came up on the F4 and then they saw, well, look at this Cadillac, right? Look at how it flies, right? So I'm sure, as we go along this pathway, right, there are folks that will go directly to an F-22 and never see the Eagle or anything that came before it. And they'll just think, oh, this is just the way things are, right? And might not have seen some of the other airplanes that come along the way. But then sure enough, there'll be some other technology that rolls in somewhere along the way that will be, again, black magic and sorcery to them, right? In the same way that the Raptor was that way to me, because you had that experience along the way. What it did teach me, though, going from Eagle to Raptor, it kind of brings up, we were talking about the test community a bit of, how do you, faster, further, higher. As a C model Eagle driver that then went to the Strike Eagle, right, and got a chance to fly that for a little bit, and then seeing the Raptor, to your point, you see that narrative and you see that story, right? Because the Eagle is, again, a beautiful machine, but it clearly had some flaws to it as well, like all airplanes do. But then when you get to the Raptor, you go, oh, I see how they fixed that. Oh, this was an issue, but I see where they now made that a part of a display, or they changed the system for it, or they provided some level of redundancy. And it was all based on feedback that came out of the Eagle community of, hey, how do we make this airplane awesomer, if I could use that word? And you see a lot of that came out in the F-22. Something very simple, right? Simple stuff. I mean, because everyone's thinking, oh, plasma rifles and torpedoes and whatever else.
We're not supposed to talk about those.
Exactly.
Sir. Come on.
A parking brake. The C model Eagle has no parking brake.
Really?
Yeah, really, right? And so whenever you get to the end of the runway and they go, oh, we got to delay the mission, whatever, that's you with your feet on the brakes, holding that thing for forever and a day. the Raptor has a parking brake. And I went, thank you. Stuff like that, right? Where the Raptor just goes, oh, okay, I see where they took this feedback and they incorporated that to make a better, we call the Eagle air superiority. The Raptor is air dominance. Those are some minor examples of where the test community, I think, was pretty helpful in making a more advanced product.
Okay, a couple hundred hours in the F-22.
Yeah.
What was, again, I always like to talk about these highs and lows. What was a flight that you just look back on and say, that is the Raptor to me, and that's the way that you communicate that to others that don't have the privilege of sitting in that airplane?
A couple of things come to mind. The first takeoff I ever got a chance to do in the Raptor, I wish I still had we call them tapes, but they're not tapes anymore. They're all digital nowadays. I wish I still had a copy of that because I was laughing the entire way. Because again, I came up in a fighter community. I'm used to max performance takeoffs and those sorts of things, not like the Raptor. And so takeoff in that airplane, and I wasn't even using the full power on the airplane, right? But the climb rate, it was like a homesick angel. It was built to do that. Extraordinarily fast rate of climb with gobs of power to spare. I felt like I was back in the Eagle, but like someone put spinach or whatever down the engine and suddenly it became Popeye and had all these superpowers. It just felt that way. And then the other part that I remember in the Raptor was we called it super maneuverability, which you saw or which you see at the air show demos that people do. I first saw that demo as an Eagle driver and I went, never get into a dogfight with a Raptor because it can do things that your airplane cannot, right? And by the way, to the earlier point, because the flight controls are so supremely designed, a relatively inexperienced Raptor pilot can have the capability of a hyper-experienced F-15 C modeled pilot, right, to get it to do that. First time, we call it a high alpha loop, which is, it's a loop like whatever else you see, anyone else do. But the difference is that as you get up to the top of the loop, you pull back on the stick, and now the thrust vectoring kicks in, and you'll get the airplane, it'll pivot kind of in three, very controllable, right? So you're not out of control at all, but it's a high angle of attack loop that you can do in the Raptor extremely easily. And the first time I did that, I remember kind of getting up into the loop, and then the instructor's like, all right, now pull back on the stick, right? Because it'll automatically engage. And the thrust vectoring kicks in, and all of a sudden it just pivots in the sky. Very controllable. And you're looking out the sides of the airplane, and I remember thinking, this thing will turn on a dime and give you back 9 cents in the process of it doing it, and extremely controllable. And so I was like, wow, this same thing. I'm laughing throughout the entire maneuver. It's like, this is awesome, right? Because in previous airplanes, to do something like that, you had to be very, very careful. Otherwise, you might depart, right? But this airplane could do it no problem. And then the other one I remember was going out to very high Mach numbers in that airplane and realizing the airplane, it was like on rails, smooth. It was built, for those types of speeds. And I remember looking out of the sides of the airplane, and it looked like the Starship Enterprise going to warp drive. Like the ground just distorted beneath me because it was so fast. And, unlike other airplanes where you start getting to the extremes of the envelope and it'll start to shimmy, she's starting to shake. This airplane was just glass smooth and would keep going. Later on, I was eventually an F-16 pilot, and I got a chance to chase the F-22 for a couple of the missions. And, the Raptor would say, all right, I'm coming up on power in 3, 2, 1. And you'd see them light the afterburners, and the back end of the airplane would open up and gigantic fire comes out. And then now I saw the Starship Enterprise from the other perspective, which means the F-16 just couldn't keep up with it. Time, space distorted, and the Raptor was miles and miles and miles away from me like it was nothing. You just start realizing that airplane is otherworldly. It's an Indy race car, Formula One built just for that purpose, and it is fantastically designed.
You mentioned another, I think, classic airplane, the F-16, and you've flown a bunch of jets, but F-15, F-22. Now you're talking about F-16 time. How does that kind of fit into that jack of all trades, master of none, but still an incredible airplane?
Yeah, and that's what I took from my time in the F-16. So going back to pilot training, when the person stood up and said, "Well, we can do a lot of," they're 100% right. The great value of the Viper is it can do all of that, and it does it sufficiently well, and it does it very economically, right? Which is why it's one of the mass exported airplanes. A lot of countries around the world fly the F-16 because if you got a limited defense budget, you want to get the best bang for your buck. Hard to beat an F-16, right? It's a good value for that. So I liked that aspect of the Viper, of whatever mission kind of tickled your fancy, you could actually learn that and get a chance to go perform that in that airplane. So for like the all-around prize fighter kind of prize, like maybe not the fastest, not the most advanced, not the most payload, not the most whatever avionics or whatever, but in terms of like overall best value, that was fantastic, right? It was a nice airplane to get a chance to see that.
Okay, so many folks that I get the chance to talk to, everyone asks the same question when you're military. Where are you from? Tullahoma, Tennessee. No one knows where.
Yeah.
No one knows where Tullahoma is. I'll say Jack Daniels is just down the road. Lynchburg. Everyone knows what Jack Daniels is. But the reason I mention that, the reason I'm even from this part of the world, both my folks work at Arnold. In fact, we were talking before we started recording. Everyone in the family has worked at Arnold except for me. So mom, dad, brother.
Yeah.
And then, as you mentioned, I've had the chance to land there in a T6 thanks to you, first person to land on the new runway, which was super, super exciting for me. But all that to mention, no one, for whatever reason, seems to realize just how critical Arnold Air Force Base, AEDC, to me, it was Arnold Engineering Development Center. Now it's complex. Things have changed. Why it's so critical to, this is the softball, sir, since you're the commander. I'm going to ask you why AEDC is so important and maybe some of the specific things about what the base does.
So I freely admit that before coming to this role, I had never been to Tennessee. And I knew of Arnold, but I had never visited Arnold before. And when I got a chance to come out here and I went, wow, this is truly an amazing place. What I've learned is this is sort of like the cradle. So it's like all these airplanes that I told you about, at some way, some shape or form passed through here in some level of development, usually at the earlier stages, because that's where we kind of get our best value, is being able to prototype and experiment and do a lot of different kind of configurations and kind of see what works. And this is the same. I love military bases that have a story behind them, right? And they all do to some extent, but some stories are like iconic, right? Like for instance, I was at Hickam Air Force Base in one of my prior jobs. And their story was, hey, you see this damage on the outside of the headquarters building? This came from the original attacks, Pearl Harbor, right? And we intentionally left it there so that we would never forget what it means to be serving in the military and why this matters and why it's so important. So when you walk into the building, you can see bullet holes and spalling marks on the outside of the headquarters building. And that was a very deliberate choice that they did, right, for a lot of the ethos behind it. The story with Arnold and the complex is very similar in that sense of it originally began with the story of Theodore von Karman, right, who was kind of the equivalent of what we would call an Air Force chief scientist today, and General Hap Arnold, which, this is just my personal opinion. Hap Arnold, of all the airmen, if I could use that term, is easily, I think, the most innovative airman that ever lived. Because if you look at high-speed flight, supersonics, computers, rocketry, all those things that were kind of iconic coming out of World War II that shaped the modern Air Force that we know today, you can trace all of that to the vision of General Arnold himself. That weighs on me, right, in a good way, that I am the commander of a base that is named in his honor, and that whenever you walk around the base, in addition to him being called Arnold, right, you see paintings and pictures and sayings that he did. And it always weighs on me that I am the caretaker of this heritage that General Arnold began, and I don't want to let him down. I don't want to let his memory down. So it weighs on me, but in a good way, right? Like, how do you challenge yourself to go do there? But back to the story, General Arnold and Theodore von Karman came to a very insightful conclusion at the end of World War II, which is that at the opening stages of World War II, we were greatly outclassed by many air forces around the world, particularly the Luftwaffe and also to some extent the Japanese Imperial Air Force, that their technologies, their airplanes, they were a generation or so ahead of us at the start of World War II. One of the major factors, I think, that went into our ultimate victory in World War II is that we had better logistics, that our factories were not attacked and that we're at full capacity and that we could just outproduce the adversaries around the world and that we could make more people, right? So as like, for instance, the best of the Luftwaffe was either shot down or whatever, and they couldn't regenerate. And now they were putting in very junior pilots into these airplanes, right? That, we, the allies, that we could still generate very capable, experienced aviators and put them on the front line. And as time went on, our capabilities got better and better and better, right? You look at what the bomber was in 1939 and you compare that to a B-29 at the end and wow, right? I mean, what an amazing leap in technology along the way. So I think the insight that Theodore von Karman had, Dr. von Karman and General Hap Arnold was, hey, we're now on the verge of this thing called the Cold War, that there will be another conflict, that we learned a hard lesson at the start of World War II, that victory in World War II wasn't a foregone conclusion. You look at some of the earlier battles, especially prior to Midway, it was touch and go for a while, whether or not the Allies could actually muster the forces to be able to go defeat Germany and Japan and Italy. And so for all those reasons, their idea was, let's create a facility whose whole point in life is to be at the forefront of the latest and greatest technology, that we will never, ever be outclassed again in that manner, and that the only way that we can do that is to be able to essentially pilfer the greatest technology that we could out of World War II, some of the best scientists, engineers, or whatever, and to be able to have a base whose whole point in life is to just think of the next thing from a technology standpoint. So that lineage still kind of drives the workforce there today, which is what are we doing to field the greatest capability to the warfighters in the most relevant time frame so that we are always ahead of the adversary and we are never ever caught again off guards in the way that we were at the start of World War II. So I love that story, right? I love that connection to history. I love that vision because everything he laid out, we actually found one of the original memos from General Arnold, right, talking about this. And you read it, and I swear to you, if you could just replace this Soviet Union and Cold War or whatever, and you could replace it with modern day adversaries, the rest of the memo reads like it was written yesterday. It's the same kind of thought of we need to always be on the forefront. Beautiful, beautiful mission for that place.
And for folks to remember, it's also not just what's the facilities here in Tennessee. There's facilities up in Maryland. There's facilities down in Florida. The Climatic Laboratory, I believe, is part of. I think there's other stuff as well, right? So it's not just the small team. Well, I say small team. The team here in Tennessee, it's folks literally across the United States, but you're concentrating all that energy and excellence to keep us on the forefront.
Multiple locations across multiple different states, like New Mexico or California or Ohio or Maryland. So it's interesting. They're all unique. They're all what I would call snowflakes, right? No two are built exactly alike. They all have a little bit of a different take on the mission, but the overarching mission is it's not the exact analogy, but it feels a lot like this. How do we perform like the Silicon Valley, if you will, for not just the Air Force, but a lot of other different customers that roll through? Because we have the ability to go do a lot of iterations very, very quickly and kind of converge on, hey, we think these are the best solutions to be able to push forward to go into further test and evaluation and eventually get fielded to the warfighter. It is a very important mission, especially kind of given the geostrategic context that we're in today. The thing I really love, even beyond just the history of the base and why it was built and what it's supposed to go do, is we talked a little bit earlier about the dedication that the civilian workforce has to this national defense mission. I have seen that in spades working around the complex of the Arnold Engineering Development kind of universe. Because again, we're almost exclusively a civilian workforce. But what I love is whether or not it's the janitor, kind of cleaning the place and making sure that we've got a sanitary environment to work in, or it's the craftsman that is extremely capable in terms of they can make anything, they can weld or build or put together. I mean, it's amazing what they can do. Whether it's like a guy like me, the super nerdy engineer, with the big Coke bottle glasses and you're pushing them up on your nose, we're all united in that same vision of, I know exactly like what we're doing here. Everyone's united around that mission. And that's kind of cool. Someone described it to me. It'd be like if you were part of like a professional NFL team and you walk the field and you're looking at the defensive line, on either side of it, and you're going, all right, we're all from different walks of life, different race backgrounds, different whatever, different genders, different socioeconomic backgrounds. It doesn't matter. I'm looking to my left and I'm looking to my right, and I've got a team that together we're just going to go clobber the other team and we're going to get to the other goal line. I love that feeling, especially when it's a whole bunch of nerds, right? Like it's being a nerd is cool.
Yes, in the best way possible.
Yeah, nowadays, in a way that I got beat up for, as a kid, but nowadays, nerd is like superpower. And when you look at some of the threats that we're facing around the world, no kidding, it's going to be the nerds, I think, that are going to be so crucial to winning that fight because it's such a high-end technology-enabled kind of conflict that we might end up in at one point.
Well, I used the word magic earlier, and that's absolutely the wrong word to use, but talking about the Raptor, because it does appear, I will just say, I think a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I'm not sure when I'll release this, but Oshkosh Air Show, got to see the Raptor demo at sunset. My gosh, like it's a beautiful airplane anyway, but seeing those big burners and seeing that nice tight profile, it was incredible to see. And I like I said, I describe it as magic, but it's not. It's literally folks at Arnold and folks all across this great country that are developing these technologies, testing them robustly. You don't just test it once and say, let's send it out to the warfighter. That doesn't get seen. It just it comes across as magic, but it doesn't necessarily get seen. It is so critical. And if it doesn't happen, like you said, we're not going to win those fights. We're not going to have the tools needed to do it. The people will do it. The people will do whatever they need to win, but we want to give them the very best tool to make it happen. And it happens in many ways at Arnold.
Yeah, it's exactly what, again, Dr. von Karman and General Arnold saw, which is, at that time facing up against a Luftwaffe, which arguably at the time was probably one of the most fearsome militaries on the planet. And you expect to go preserve freedom and democracy and all those things that we really care about and that we value. that to be able to do that, you want to go arm the men and women that would go fight that with the best capability in the world. I mean, I give this other analogy to people that may not be familiar with what the test world is all about. I'm a huge movie fan. I love cars. Movies and cars are kind of like the universal translator. It doesn't matter what background you are. We all have some exposure to cars and some exposure to movies or whatever. In the 007 series and James Bond, there was always a period somewhere in there. It didn't matter who was playing James Bond. There was some point where they went to go see Q, and Q would say, okay, here's your Mercedes-Benz, but if you hit this button, the headlights fold down and there's machine guns in there. Or here's this gum that, if you do this, it's an explosive. Or here's this lapel pin that's really a camera or whatever. At some point in James Bond's mission, there would be at some point where he needed to pull out that capability and use it, and it saved the day. So we in the test community, at least I do, I tend to think of myself as we're Q. Like our whole job is to have this lab, if you will, of engineering capabilities that we can deploy and get directly to the warfighter, because that's going to be the critical thing that enables helping to win the day. Now, James Bond still had all of the experience and kind of knew whatever, but at some point there was something where when the chips are down, he had this capability that he could pull out of his sleeve, and it was exactly the right thing that helped save the mission, or save the day. That's kind of what I view us as.
For folks in the community, folks maybe not even just live local to Tennessee, the only exposure they might have to the base, to Arnold, is maybe driving by on the Wattendorf Highway, looking, there's a bunch of trees, and I see a gate over there, and that's about all they see. Maybe photos they see online or a news release about some fancy technology demonstrator or something impressive that just, it seems very foreign. It seems very off there in the distance.
Yeah.
You literally oversee all of it.
Yeah.
If you could take someone behind the gates and show them some of those incredible things, what's something maybe you'd brag on about AEDC?
The main thing I'm still bowled over by, beyond the people, right? The people, number one, hands down, right? It leaps ahead of anything else I'm about to tell you. But the other thing that's amazing is just the infrastructure that's there. Again, as a nerd, I'm amazed at these gigantic multiple city block size test units, right? For wind tunnels or rocket test stands or whatnot that are built there. That it was funny. I was actually having a discussion with some of the team earlier. In today's day and age, we pride ourselves on how small everything is, right? Hey, look at what I can fit in my pocket with this iPhone. And so it's all about miniaturization and the power of computer simulation to do X, Y, or Z. What you come to realize is that there are many areas where even the computers can't reliably predict what's going to happen at kind of these extremes of the envelopes of some of these things that we're trying to test. And the only way that you can get there is good old-fashioned nuts and bolts and industrial machinery the size of city blocks designed to take a molecule of air that is sitting at whatever conditions at Tullahoma and to be able to make it think that it's operating at whatever altitude and whatever speed and whatever temperature. And to be able to get all that, you need this multiple size city blocks of compressors and air conditioning units and dryer units and whatnot that eventually get to this small little test cell section where we have some test item. And in that little tiny little piece of real estate, it thinks it's operating at whatever condition that we tell it. And because it's the real hardware operating in the quote unquote real air environment that we've chewed on that air molecule to make it think it. Now the data that we're getting out of that is like legit. You can go to the bank with that and say, I know how it's going to perform here. And you can do that quickly and cheaply, if I could say, in a way that you learn something valuable and relevant that eventually fields to a system. So we are a flight simulation environment, but simulation being in terms of we generate the data that ultimately feeds into those models that you can use for a computer. But before you ever get there, you got to validate that the model is correct. And so that's where we have our real value add, I think. And just seeing the industrial scale of the machinery, especially for a person that was born in, the digital era, to be able to go back to what it was like for like my father or my grandfather, where they actually took out gigantic mallets with gigantic wrenches and huge bolts and connected things and made things with their hands and, welded all this stuff together with these huge units. It's fascinating to see the industrial scale of what that complex is. And that's true as I go around all the other places as well. And you sit there and go, only a superpower can have this, right? This isn't for anyone else. You got to have a lot of resources in place to be able to get to that level of scale of the technology development that we have.
America's Aerospace Advantage is kind of the tagline for AEDC. I don't know if it's been rebranded since then, but that's what I remembered as a kid. And I always like to tell folks that it punches above its weight in many ways, but also if you want to see the future, if you want to see where things are headed for our country, for our Air Force, and I say this as a naval aviator, of course, but that stuff trickles down to us eventually too, over on the Navy side. But it's happening here at Arnold, and there's so many smart folks. I know there's jobs open. If people want to kind of pursue that path, there's a way to do it. And like you mentioned, no one just steps in as a genius day one. Everyone has to cut their teeth and learn. And I think I mentioned my brother, some of the folks he worked with, even as an intern. We were both in college at Tennessee Tech. When he was doing an internship at the base, some of the team he worked with, just just legends in the field, and the things that they do, it's really, really incredible. It makes me really proud to be from Tullahoma.
Yeah.
It's the reason we're here in the first place. So, okay, sir, I promised at the end we were going to talk about call signs. What's yours and what's the story?
This is another good story. I share this story. I'll give you the headline or the bumper sticker up front. I got lucky. I wish I could sit here and tell you I was the greatest aviator the world's ever seen. I'm not. I wasn't then. I'm not now. But it strikes to all the different things that I love about serving in the military and the things that I'll still carry with me long after at some point when I leave and go off to do something else. It was Alaska. Every good story starts with, there I was. And no kidding, it was a very, very dark night in Alaska, because we're so high in latitude up on the Earth's surface that there are periods of time where the sun really doesn't come above the horizon. It stays perpetually dark. Right, just like it does in the summertime when now it's like perpetual light. This is one of those times of year where it was perpetual dark. And we talked a lot about the weather in Alaska, just how challenging it was. It just was. This is one of those days where it was like overcast from 1,000 feet or whatever, all the way up to 30,000 feet, just like that type of weather. And it was, dark, whole 9 yards. We were getting ready to deploy a lot of our F-15s. We were going down to Nellis to do the red flag exercise, a very iconic, storied place where we train our people to be ready for the first night of the war. Wonderful training. But to do that, we needed to get the jets down there in the first place. So the idea was take off a 8 ship of F-15s such that you would at least have 6 airplanes that are in good shape, at least, to join on the tanker and then to be able to fly with the tanker all the way from Anchorage, Alaska down to Las Vegas, Nevada. And so I had just become mission ready in the airplane, maybe about a week or two prior. So you graduate Tyndall, you show up at your operational unit, you're still not combat ready because you have to go through a spool up there, and that takes some time to go through. I had just completed that training, and so now I had arrived, right? I mean, you had gone through, all the stuff we talked about, all the stuff growing up in New York, Air Force Academy, pilot training, right? All the different schools. And then you get to the unit, you get trained up in the unit, and now you're what we call a mission-ready aviator. You're still a wingman, but at least if the balloon went up, you could go to combat with the unit, right, to go do that. And so I just achieved that. And so my thinking at the time was, you do not want to look foolish in front of your because you don't want to let them down. You don't want to, man, we made a mistake on that guy. Like, are you sure that person should be here? Like, I don't know how that person made it through all that training, but I don't know about that one, right? So everything about your mindset and your mentality is, I got to be perfect. I can never be late to a brief. I always got to be, no matter what it is, whatever task I'm given, I got to do it. And I got to do it at like LeBron James level, very, very high end. So I'm on this formation of airplanes that is getting ready to go to Las Vegas, Nevada for the red flag exercise. And all I could think was, whenever they call me on the radio, I'm going to be there. Whenever this happens, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to be perfect. And we talked about how bad the weather was. So we're taxiing out and we're getting ready to take off. And I'm looking around and the weather's just atrociously bad. I mean, it is just awful. And we had been trying to get down to Nellis for a number of times. And every time we tried, the weather would roll in. The weatherman would say, you can't make it today. We'd all show up at 5 in the morning and weather canceled by 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning, go home, grumpy, upset, whatever, whole 9 yards. It was like the third day that we had tried to do this. So now we're like determined, right? We're trying to get out there. The weather was terrible. It was just barely good enough for us to actually try to get airborne that day. And because we had tried and failed so many times before, and you're up against the clock and red flag's going to kick off if you're there or not, it was, hey, we got to go. So we take it. We take this window. Number 1 takes the runway, and we're fully loaded F-15s with the 3 external fuel tanks, heavy. We got all of our golf clubs and clothes in the back and whatnot. So the airplane by F-15 C model standards is very, very heavy. So the only way that you can get airborne with that amount of weight is to use full afterburner as you're rolling down the runway. And because they had just de-iced the runway, every time an F-15 would rotate the nose to get airborne, the afterburner plumes would hit the runway and evaporate that de-ice fluid that had been sitting down there. So it generates this gigantic steam cloud. So now the weather is really low. And it's almost like weather was coming up from the ground because the steam cloud, because again, I'm number 8 in this. So number 1 goes, takes off, goes. A couple seconds behind that, number 2 goes, right? Number 3, number 4, so they all go, and as they each go, they all rotate about that same point on the runway. And again, that steam cloud's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. By the time I get out there, I'm looking forward, and again, it's dark. You can barely see out in front. The weather's atrocious, and I'm rolling down the runway. And even before I get airborne, I'm already in this steam cloud of de-iced fluid that evaporated because multiple 1,000-degree Fahrenheit temperature just hit it and just. So I remember being in the quote-unquote weather even before the landing gear retracted. So I'm putting the gear up, can't see anything, and it's completely pitch black outside and in the clouds immediately. And we're doing what's called a radar-assisted trail departure, which means that it's a type of formation that we use to get everybody through the weather, where you're using the radar to lock on to the guy in front of you and make sure that you maintain the proper spacing, and you got to make some radio calls and whole 9 yards to make it happen, right? And so in my mind, again, I'm in this mode of you're a young lieutenant. You've spent your whole life up to this point to get mission ready, and all I want to do is to show all these people that I deserve to be there, right? And I don't want to make a mistake. I'm going to be Johnny on the spot. Doesn't matter what's going to happen. So I do the very first thing, which was wrong, which is that I paid a lot of attention to the radar and the radio, and I didn't pay so much attention to flying the airplane, right? We always say aviate, navigate, communicate. Control the aircraft first, and I failed at that because I was so concerned because I wanted to lock the right guy. I didn't want to lock number 6 or number 5, right? I wanted to lock number 7, right? And to be exactly in the right position. And I wanted to call on the radio, hey, I'm tied and we're ready to go, and the whole 9 yards. And, as luck would have it, right in that moment where the landing gear is retracted and I can't see a thing and it's completely pitch black out in front of me, at that point, I experienced a gigantic avionics failure. And everything that tells me which way is up or down, the attitude indicator, the heads up display, all of that freezes and locks in position. And I didn't notice that. Normally, if it were like day, what we call VFR conditions, right? Beautiful outside, who cares? I got this gigantic attitude indicator called the Earth, right? And you can look outside and I can see blue sky and I can see green ground, whatever, right? Life goes on. But when it's dark outside and the clouds are there and you can't see a thing, it's amazing. We train a lot about the illusions that your body will think, like if your eyeballs can't see, but your inner ear is sensing motion, you'll get the leans, you'll get whatever. So I got into spatial disorientation, and it was the type of spatial disorientation that was not recognized. So in my mind, I'm thinking, because the departure at Elmendorf is you take off and you immediately go into a left-hand turn because there's a mountain range directly in front of you. So in my jet, I'm taking off, I can't see a thing, the landing gear is retracting, I'm already in the clouds, I want to look good, sound good on the radio, whatever, and impress all these people in front of me. I devote all of my attention to the stupid radar rather than just fly the airplane and fly your parameters, fly your altitude, fly your airspeed. And when I do that, and I have this avionics failure, everything on the radar itself has what we call birds. Birds are like a colloquialism that says it's spurious crap, right? It's just stuff all over the radar that isn't an actual target, but the radar just gets completely overwhelmed. It's not sure what's thinking. So I'm trying to lock anything and it'll lock and it's kind of like, and I'll just kind of drop it, right? And then you try another lock and it does the same thing and it falls away. And I'm so focused on that, and I'm not focused on flying the airplane, that instinctively I roll into a left bank because I know that's what I got to do on departure, but I don't really fully realize how left I actually rolled the airplane because I can't see anything. It's all at 1G is what it was. I could never recreate this ever again, but it's kind of like in the old Bob Hoover days, when he would do this demonstration in the Aero Commander and he'd pour a glass of water when he's upside down. To the outside observer, the water is still flowing into the cup because he's doing this barrel roll at exactly 1G because he was awesome. I did an inadvertent Bob Hoover and was what I thought went in a left-hand turn when in reality I was actually upside down. And it was, again, you're low to the ground, right off of takeoff, heavy weight. In my inner ear, I'm thinking, oh yeah, left-hand turn, whatever, no problem. In reality, it was a perfect half barrel roll in the weather at 1G. So the only way I figure this out, because I look inside and I go, man, the airspeed feels a bit slower. Like, not that I had flown the jet a lot, but you start picking up all these other cues. Like, you start knowing, okay, this is what it sounds like when the wind rush goes over the canopy. And you just get used to that, right? You just kind of, and I was like, yeah, it seems a little quiet. And I look at the airspeed indicator. That one was still working. And it was reading much slower speed, right, than what should have been based on my power setting and what I thought was my pitch setting. And I look at the attitude indicator, but it's frozen. I don't know this yet, right? I'm like, oh, that shows a left bank. What's the problem? Everything should be good, right? Then I look at the altimeter, and the altimeter is much higher than what it should have been at that point in the departure. And I'm trying to put 2 and 2 together, like, why is my airspeed so low and my altitude so high, but the attitudes show a left bank, like normal bank kind of stuff. And it was at that point I realized, dude, something happened. Right? So now you go from unrecognized to recognized. And what they don't say a lot in your academics is the moment that it goes from unrecognized to recognized, a millisecond after that is terror. because you go, what attitude am I really actually at, right? Because I don't know, but I know I shouldn't be that slow and I shouldn't be that high. And here's where the luck part comes in. In the clouds, I mean, all aviators know this, but maybe non-aviators, maybe you don't know. Next time you're in like a commercial airliner or something like that and you're flying through the weather, every once in a while, there's little holes in the clouds. Every once in a while, little pockets. And by the grace, right, that's the only way I can describe it. My jet happened to go through one of those holes in the clouds. And it was just enough where I could see the lights of Anchorage shining up through the clouds, but those lights were above my canopy. So I'm looking up at the city of Anchorage, when in reality, the city of Anchorage should be below the airplane because it's just a normal. And then it kind of hit me like, you are upside down, because there's no way a city could be above the jet unless I, right, am upside down looking down at the city in that way. So I look in the F-15 and we got to a little bit of, hey, test pilots and some of the things. In the F-15C model, the standby attitude indicator is way at the bottom of the cockpit, down by your right knee, a little bit behind the stick. At night, to be frank, it's poorly lit, and it's this tiny, tiny little peanut gauge that is hard to kind of make out which way is up or down on it. But it's a standby gauge. It's completely independent of all the rest of the avionics on the airplane. And that thing, when I looked down there, said I was upside down. And it's hard, right? Because you got to make a mental leap to not look at your heads-up display and your main attitude indicator and go, that's messing me up. If I look at that, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. I got to look at that standby gauge. That's the only thing that makes sense based on the fact that the city of Anchorage is above my head, right? How does the city end up there? And the standby gauge said that you're upside down. In the Raptor, the standby gauge is directly in your field of vision, and it's big, right? It's huge, right? So that you don't make that mistake. And if worse comes to worse, you can do a couple switchologies, and like your big display that sits in front of you, you can convert that to a gigantic attitude indicator. And I think a lot of that was just based on some of the sins in the design of this C model Eagle, right, that they fixed on Raptor. So a little bit of a side story of why test pilot work is good stuff. So I end up recovering off of that standby gauge. And again, I'm heavyweight, low to the ground. All I could think to do was to roll based on that standby gauge, go full afterburner on the engines, take both hands, put them on the flight control stick, and pull for all she is worth. Now, the technical correct answer is I should have ejected. Should have. But to all the folks out there, because I used to wonder this. I don't wonder this anymore, but you read these accident reports of, oh, so-and-so happened. How come they never ejected? The reason is, and I know this because in my mind, it never crossed my head because all I could think of is, again, I'm a young pilot. I don't want to be known as that dude. I want to be able to recover this airplane. I want to sound good on the radio. I'm going to be in position. And all I could think of in that moment was, I'm going to fly this airplane out of this. I can save this, right? And it never ever, now looking back on it, dumb, right? Should have ejected, didn't. The jet, I mean, obviously I'm sitting here telling you the story. So the jet does recover, but it recovers probably within easily 1 to 2 seconds of actually hitting the ground. It was that close. So had I had not flown through that little piece of cloud and saw Anchorage above me, and had I not looked down at that standby gauge, I very easily could have rolled and made it even worse, right, and pulled directly into the ground. But we talked a little bit about that time dilation I had off the T-38 when I took the bat down the left engine. This was another time in my life where time slowed way down. And I remember I had this image in my head that the jet would hit the ground, that the nose would crumple in front of me, and that the last thing I would see is the canopy shattering and like just, and that'd be it, right? I had that image in my mind, and we didn't talk too much about this, but I had been married by that point for all of about maybe a month. So I would have widowed my wife. And the emotion that went through my mind at that point, it wasn't like fear. I was pissed, right? Like I was angry, right? I was like, I can't believe I got to this point and worked this hard to be able to sit in this cockpit at this squadron to be in part of this mission, and on a normal routine takeoff that I'm going to bite it off of this. I was angry at myself and angry at the world. I can't believe, and that would have been the last thought that I would have had, right? When that would, if I had impacted. The jet does recover. I know there's this little pocket of, cloud where there's some visibility, not much, but some. And so I climb back up and I find that small little pocket again, and I stay right there. I don't go anywhere. So I kind of go into an orbit. By this point, the other 7 airplanes, right, they're way gone. And they had done a radio frequency change, and they check everybody in on the new frequency. And I'm not there, right? Because my brain is, I'm back there trying to save my own life here and save the jet. So the flight lead checks everybody in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No 8, right? Check again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. no 8. So he comes up on the backup radio that we had, and he's like, 8? It's no, what's up? You should be on frequency blah. You kind of, I could hear that edge in flight lead's voice. And by that point, any thought in my mind of, I got to look and sound good on the radio because I don't want to, gone. Because by that point, now the anger that I had when I was about to hit the ground, now that converted to, you get the jitter, like I'm shaking in the cockpit, and I was like, oh my God, I almost bit it, right? And so at this point, it's just absolute fear of kind of what it is. So he hears that in my voice, and so immediately, like, the tenor of it changes because they know I'm spatially disoriented. They don't know exactly where I'm at, but they know that mountain range is back there. And so immediately, like, the other 7 guys come up on you, dude, turn, climb, do whatever, because they're thinking I'm about to hit the ground. And I was trying to explain, I was like, hey, I almost hit the ground, but I'm in this piece of cloud here where I can see a little bit of the ground and a little bit around me, and I'm not going anywhere because something's gigantically wrong with my airplane, but I don't really know what that is. What I always remember, and this gets to why I love the military so much, number 7, who is still one of my best friends to this day, peels off from the rest of the formation. Again, it's crappy weather. Can't see a thing, but he uses the radar, finds me on the radar. Our little fuzz buster, right, our radar, so it lights up in the F-15 and goes beep, right? And I go, oh, okay, so someone's now locked onto me with their radar. And so that's him, right, finding me in the weather. The Eagle doesn't have strobe lights like a lot of other airplanes do. So it's not the white flashing strobe lights that you get. Instead, what it has is it has these red beacons that are on the wing roots, and they just kind of pulsate. There's kind of glow, right? But it's not that white flash of strobe that you get. It's more of a glowing kind of thing. So I hear the radar warning receiver kick off that he found me. And then the next thing I see is those red pulsating kind of beacons come out of the clouds. And it was like this perfect rejoin off of my right side. And then suddenly this terrible day, right, got a whole lot better because now I've got somebody with me. And I know his airplane is good. My airplane's totally jacked up. I'm even worse than the airplane by this point. And he's right there alongside, and he would have been dead to rights to basically completely chew me out. Like, what are you doing, stupid lieutenant, wingman, blah, blah, we told you, blah, 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 blah. Didn't do any of that stuff. Instead, what he did is he said, hey, Randy, how you doing? You all right? Hey, man, what's your attitude indicator showing? Oh, it's showing left bank 15 degrees. Nah, you're not really in that. You're really in a right turn, and here's your bank angle. Oh, thanks, right? What's your altitude show? I show about 3,000 feet. Okay, that one's good. I got 3,000 feet as well. Okay, so we go through, gauge by gauge by gauge. What's up? Everything look good? Okay, you good? Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, man. And he goes, okay, here's what we're going to do. And it was that total like FM DJ voice, like just, you've dialed into WSB, the smooth, quiet hour, and he was, all right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to hang out with you. I'm going to fly with you. I'm going to bring you up above the weather. The weather's really tall today, so we're going to get up to about 20,000, 30,000 feet, somewhere around there. We're going to break out. I'm going to let you see what the horizon looks like, right? And all these leans are going to go away. You understand? Okay, so hang with me. Stay right on my wing. I got you the whole time. Got you. Does that. We get up above the clouds, and in like 2 milliseconds, the moment I saw the sun a little bit, because again, it's Anchorage and night, so you don't really see the full sunrise, but you see enough of a glimmer at high enough altitude that you can kind of make out which way's sky, which way's ground. The moment we came out of the clouds, all of the leans, all of the disorientation immediately went away. Immediately, like milliseconds, like, oh, got it, right? And then I could finally look and go, that's the horizon, and I could see just how messed up my attitude indicator really was. I went, whew. He's like, all right, you good? Yeah, I'm good. All right, now here's what we're going to do. I'm going to lead you back down. We're going to set up on an instrument approach. I'm going to put you in the lead. I'm going to be right there on your wing, and you're going to lead, and you're going to touch down first. I'm going to go around, and I'm going to fly another approach behind you, and I'm going to land behind you. You good? Yeah, I'm good. What's your fuel weight? Okay, good landing weight. It's good. All right, here we go. Same thing. Gets me down, gets me set up on approach, does the old, you have the lead, passes me the lead, right? The weather's getting a little bit better, but not much, but enough where we can see each other. Sets me up perfectly for instrument landing approach, land, breakout, touchdown. It's great. He goes around, does the same thing, lands, touchdown. It's great. Now, by this point, everybody else in the formation is like halfway down to Las Vegas by this point. They're gone. We were the only reason that we were flying at that base that day. So when we get to the end of the runway, it's just his jet and my jet, and no one else is around. He pulls up, opens up his visor, drops his mask, looks over at me, kind of does the old, wipes his forehead like, woo, that was close, kind of gives me a thumbs up like, you're all right, dude. And it's like, yeah, I'm fine. I got it. So we go shut down. Again, we're the only airplanes running on the entire base that day. I was the last jet to shut down. What I always remember is the Eagle canopy is this, it's like a boat. It's like a glass bottom boat. It's freaking huge. You pull a lever on the right side of the jet, and the canopy kind of backs up a little bit and kind of goes up, and you hear this pneumatic like, as it kind of rises up. As the engines turn off, you can hear the compressor blades kind of clicking in the engine inlet. So you hear click, 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 and as it's slowing down, as the engines are shut down. And so I remember hearing all this, and to the point about I was hyper aware on my first combat mission. I was hyper aware in that moment of all of the sensations that were happening around me. I could hear like each individual compressor blade just click, 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 click as it was winding back a bit. And again, it started to snow a little bit in Anchorage. And so as I'm taking off my helmet, there's a snowflake that lands on my nose, and it melts right on my nose. And that sensation of a cold snowflake like melting and turning in the water was sublime. I mean, it was totally cool. So I lived, right? And the crew chief puts the ladder up on the jet and kind of climbs up, and he looks at me, because normally by that point they grab like all of your gear and welcome. He climbs up the ladder, takes one look at me. I'm not, I got everything still on except for my helmet, and he looks at me like, yeah, it looks like you need a minute or two, and just he could tell I was kind of messed up, right? And just kind of, I'm going to give you your time, and climbs down the ladder and sits down on the other side. So I was alive. And that fact wasn't lost on me, because everything was great flying until it wasn't. And then when it wasn't, it was catastrophic. And I knew, even that young, that I had dodged a bullet. It came within seconds. I was grateful for that moment for no other reason than to sit in the Eagle cockpit with snowflakes melting on my nose. So later on, to the point about how you get your call sign and name, but that's the whole story behind it. Later on, we eventually do make it down to Nellis. We do the airliner because all the jets are there. They got their 6 airplanes. They were fine. So we buy commercial tickets, fly from Anchorage all the way down to Las Vegas, rejoin the squadron, and the aggressor bar at the time was where I got named. So the aggressors are all of the adversary units, the F-16, whatever, that we're supposed to pretend like they're the adversary air. So we're in their bar, and every fighter squadron has this one fighter pilot that never made it above the rank of major, doesn't ever want to make it above the rank of major, could care less, right? I mean, just wants to fly jets and go kill MiGs and whatever else. We had a guy like that in our unit. So he shows up, he's got like 2 mugs of beer in one hand and like 5 cigars in the other. They're all lit. And he kind of smacks me on the back of my back there, and he kind of goes, he's talking to the bar, right? Everyone else is sitting around there, and he goes, how many of you guys thought this guy was a goner? And like the whole bar just erupts like, duh, because they're all in that formation with me, right? And they start telling stories about, yeah, dude, we thought you were totally going to die, whatever hell I did. So eventually, he kind of says, well, how about we call him Lazarus, right? And the whole bar, like, yeah, what? This whole place like erupts. And then someone, like the little voice in the back of the room somewhere, like, that's too many syllables. Why don't we just call him Laz, like L-A-Z, because that's easier to say on the radio, like Laz, break left, right? As opposed to Lazarus, break left. So it came down to Laz, right? L-A-Z, short for Lazarus, based on the biblical story of coming back from the dead. If you've flown long enough, there's always been stories of people that got spatially disoriented and it didn't work out like in the way that it did in my case. And so for a lot of folks, I mean, you'll run into some pilots that hate their call signs. I love mine to the point where it's almost like I prefer that to my actual name, because it reminds me that, hey, no matter how bad a day you're having, and we all have them, right? We all have bad days. No matter how bad a day you're having, it was nowhere near as bad as that day. That day stunk, right? I never want to feel that way in anything, right, ever again. It reminds me of being grateful kind of in the moment for what you have, because I knew that in that moment, again, I would have widowed my wife. I never would have gone on to have all this flying experiences that we just talked about, made all those friends and had those networks and whatever that I kind of came to grow in the Air Force. Never would have been a parent. And all that could have been taken away literally in just a second or two if I had pulled the wrong direction, right, and gone down as opposed to head up. So it's a good call sign. Plus, I also look back and go, man, I had a fantastic wingman, right? And we talk a lot in the Air Force about other things like, people go through tough times. And this wingman concept of, hey, in the fighter world, you never go into combat alone. You always have a team around you. You got your wingman. And we talk about how we can use that in our personal lives. Well, on that day, I learned what a wingman was, because that wingman, in much the same way that you could argue I saved me by pulling in the right direction, the rest of the story would not have been possible if I didn't have my wingman sitting there alongside of me, talking me down and helping me figure out what was wrong and just being there, because I wasn't alone. Like no matter what else happened that day, if eventually I had to eject, I knew that I wouldn't have done that alone. I would have had him with me, right, to help direct the rescue forces to come find where I was at. So to have a wingman, it really taught me that in that particular day. And the last thing it taught about is, this is a podcast about aviation and those sorts of things. From that moment forward, I never went through the look at me, hold my beer later stage, because I realized that, hey, aviation is fantastically cool. It is awesome, but it will be unforgiving of you if you go outside of the limits and decide, oh, I'm going to do all these other things. Because, we have a saying in the Air Force, I'm sure the Navy has the same way, that a lot of our rules are written in blood, that someone died because of that. So that's why they put that warning into the checklist or something. So it made me a much more disciplined aviator, because I knew what it was like to be just moments away from facing your own death in an airplane. And I kind of went, okay, the rules are good for me. Right? I have no need to stretch these, and I need to be very disciplined, because I love flying. I absolutely love flying, and I want to keep doing it for as long as I can. But the only way you get there is by, being a very disciplined aviator about know your checklist, know your procedures. If you don't feel like it's the right time to fly, don't. Use good crew coordination. All those different things that we talk about all the time, those aren't academic to me. They're real, because all those things either got me into trouble or saved me, once I was in trouble, to be able to still land the airplane and to be able to have this conversation with you today. So I actually look back on the experience with a lot of gratitude, and look back and go, I'm glad that happened to me when I was that young, so that I never went through the, hey, watch this, stage. Never did that.
Well, as you mentioned, gratitude. First off, thank you so much for spending so much time sharing your stories. It's been incredible. Yeah. Great way to spend a Sunday for me. So I'm very, very thankful to you. Yeah. And then also want to end it with you. You get the last word. Anything maybe I didn't ask you about, or anything we should have talked about? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, copy. Well, one, thanks for the opportunity. I kind of look, if we go all the way back to the story of Mae Jemison, I look back on that and I go, Mae opened up a world to me through no other thing than just her humility, the ability to share a story, words, right? Simple words. Words made a difference for this shy, awkward, nervous kid sitting up in the whatever, wondering what to do with his life, and listening to her story really made a difference for me, right? And so I've looked at that as, okay, that's one of my missions kind of heading forward, is what piece of advice, what story, what vulnerability can I share that might make a difference to perhaps one of your listeners, where maybe they're struggling with something like that as well, or they're wondering what to do, or again, they think, oh, here's this Air Force colonel that flew the Raptor and the Viper and the A-10 and the F-15 and how perfect and whatever else like that. And all of that is exactly from what I got from Mae, which was, don't let you be the one to tell yourself no. Like, if you really want to go do it, put it on the table, right? This is what I want to go do. And you might tell me no, but that's going to be you, right? Telling me no, right? So I've looked at this opportunity as, like we say in the Air Force, one of our previous chiefs of staff of the Air Force would say, hey, when you get command, you get the mic. That the expectation is that you're sharing the Air Force story, that you are, like, very much in the way that we talked about, hey, who are my mentors or whatever coming up, and we talked about Magoo Miller, right? Magoo did this for me, where if you walk into a room and he's the weatherman and he shows up and says, hey, man, it's a bright sunny day, even if it's dark and crappy outside, but the simple fact that he had that outlook on life, I look at opportunities like this to be able to be that for somebody else. So again, to the listeners, my hope is that some of this story, maybe there's a tie-in to something you've got going on in your life. Just realize that, a lot of folks have been through that before, and that's completely normal. And, I'm kind of a living example of what can happen if people reach out and want to be a good mentor to you and to help you along the way. Because there's no way I got to this position without having people looking out for me. There's no way I got this position without having wingmen that were surrounding me, that have my best interests at heart and were trying to, make me better. So I look at this as an opportunity for me to kind of pay that forward and pass it forward. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to come here and sit here and chat about this.
Thanks, as always, for taking the time and tuning in to Safe on Deck. Hope you enjoyed this episode. It shouldn't need to be said, but just in case, I'll say it. The views and opinions presented on Safe on Deck are my own, and those of my guests, and do not represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or its components. Be well and fly safe out there. See you next time.